Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity settles in quietly, science moves at a comfortable pace, and the goal is not urgency, but understanding. This is a place for slow exploration, the kind where facts unfold gently and ideas are allowed to breathe. Tonight's journey drifts toward a corner of the world that looks calm on the surface, yet holds more unanswered questions than almost any other freshwater place on Earth. We're heading to Lake Baikal, a vast cold lake in Siberia that appears peaceful when photographed from above, especially in winter when ice stretches across it like frosted glass. But beneath that still exterior lies water deeper than most people expect, older than many mountain ranges, and filled with life forms that scientists are still trying to catalogue properly. Lake Baikal does not shout for attention the way oceans do. It does not send waves crashing onto crowded beaches or dominate travel brochures. Instead, it sits quietly, holding about 20% of the planet's unfrozen freshwater. That fact alone already places it in a unique category. Then comes its age, roughly 25 million years, which makes it the oldest known freshwater lake still existing in its original form. For comparison, most lakes last only a few tens of thousands of years before filling with sediment or changing shape. Baikal has persisted long enough to witness dramatic shifts in climate, geography and biological evolution. That long continuity gives it something scientists find incredibly valuable: stability. Stability allows species to evolve in isolation, sometimes into forms that seem unfamiliar compared with relatives elsewhere. Because of that isolation, Baikal hosts thousands of species found nowhere else. Some look ordinary until examined closely. Others appear distinctly unusual even at first glance. And whenever humans discover ecosystems with that level of uniqueness, speculation follows naturally. Some speculation stays grounded in science, some drifts toward folklore, and some settles somewhere in between, where curiosity mixes with imagination. That is where the idea of prehistoric creatures lingering in the depths begins to surface. Not necessarily giant reptiles from cinema posters, but organisms whose ancestry reaches far back, survivors from ancient ecological conditions that no longer exist on the surface world. Before moving deeper into that, it helps to picture the environment itself. The lake stretches about 600 kilometers from north to south, narrow compared with its length, and plunges to depths exceeding 1,600 meters. That is deeper than many seas along continental shelves. Water at those depths remains near freezing year-round. Pressure increases steadily, light fades quickly, food becomes scarce. Conditions like that do not favour large active predators the way tropical oceans might, yet they do favour specialists. Evolution tends to reward efficiency there, not spectacle. Many deep-water Baikal species are small, slow-growing, and adapted to conserve energy. Still, size alone does not determine whether a creature feels ancient or mysterious. Sometimes it is structure. Some Baikal fish lack swim bladders. Some crustaceans grow unusually large compared with relatives elsewhere. Some organisms display traits considered primitive in evolutionary terms. That does not mean they are unchanged fossils walking around. Evolution continues everywhere, but it does mean they carry features that connect them more directly to older biological lineages. Stories have circulated for centuries among local communities living near the lake. Indigenous Buryat folklore includes references to spirits or large unseen presences in the water. Russian explorers in the 19th century occasionally reported strange sightings, usually vague shapes beneath ice or unexpected movements far from shore. Most of those accounts remain anecdotal. None provide concrete biological evidence, yet they contribute to an atmosphere where mystery feels plausible. Scientists naturally approach the question differently. Instead of asking whether monsters exist, they ask what species have been documented, what ecological niches remain poorly studied, and what technological limitations still prevent complete observation. Lake Baikal is vast enough that even modern sonar mapping has not captured every detail. Deep sediment layers preserve environmental records stretching back millions of years, but accessing them requires specialized drilling equipment and logistical coordination in extreme weather. Even routine sampling can be challenging. Winter ice thickness can exceed a meter, which provides a stable platform for research stations, but also complicates equipment deployment. Summer conditions, while milder, introduce storms, waves, and strong winds. Remote location adds another layer. Transportation infrastructure exists, yet large-scale expeditions still demand careful planning. At this point, it becomes interesting to consider the psychological side of hidden creatures. Humans consistently associate deep water with unknown life. Oceans inspire similar speculation. Lakes rarely reach oceanic depth, so when one does, imagination fills the gap quickly. That response is not irrational. Historically, many new species have indeed been discovered in poorly explored habitats. Giant squid remained largely mythical until reliable specimens appeared. Coelacanth fish, once believed extinct for 65 million years, turned out to be alive in deep marine environments. Those examples encourage open-minded curiosity, though they do not guarantee equivalent discoveries everywhere. So the question begins to form naturally. If you were sitting near Lake Baikal right now, perhaps in a quiet cabin while wind moves lightly over frozen water, what time would it be where you're listening from, and would you find the idea comforting or slightly unsettling that beneath several hundred meters of dark water there might be species not yet fully documented? Not necessarily dangerous, not cinematic monsters, just organisms continuing their existence largely unnoticed. If this kind of calm exploration appeals to you, if slow science discussions help you relax or simply give your mind something steady to follow at the end of the day, leaving a like or subscribing does help this channel continue reaching people who enjoy this quieter approach. It keeps this space going without rush, without noise, just steady curiosity. Now, returning to Baikal itself, one detail often overlooked is how transparent its water can be. Visibility sometimes reaches 40 meters. That clarity comes partly from cold temperatures limiting bacterial growth, and partly from unique plankton species that filter particles efficiently. Surface clarity, however, does not translate to deep visibility. Light absorption still occurs. Past certain depths, darkness becomes total. Cameras require artificial lighting. Artificial lighting alters animal behavior, so observation always carries some distortion. Temperature layering also matters. Surface water warms slightly in summer. Deeper layers remain near 4 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature of maximum density for fresh water. That stability reduces vertical mixing compared with many lakes. Limited mixing means nutrients circulate slowly. Ecosystems become highly specialized. Predators and prey develop precise relationships. One well-known resident is the Baikal seal, or Nerpa. It is the only exclusively freshwater seal species. How it arrived there remains debated. One hypothesis suggests migration through river systems connected to Arctic seas during past geological periods. Genetic studies support some marine ancestry. Its presence demonstrates that significant biological transitions can occur over long time scales, reinforcing the idea that Baikal's ecosystem preserves unusual evolutionary stories. Then there are amphipods, small crustaceans that in Baikal sometimes grow much larger than typical relatives. Some reach several centimeters, which does not sound dramatic until compared with millimeter-scale counterparts elsewhere. Cold, oxygen-rich water supports such growth. Oxygen penetrates deeply because the lake rarely stratifies completely. That oxygen availability allows animals to inhabit depths where other lakes might become anoxic. Fish diversity includes the golomyanka, a translucent species rich in oil content. It gives birth to live young rather than laying eggs, uncommon among fish. Its physiology suits cold, deep conditions. Predators include omul, a whitefish species important both ecologically and economically. Fishing pressure has fluctuated over decades, leading to conservation measures. When researchers deploy submersibles, they sometimes report unexpected density variations, acoustic reflections that do not correspond immediately to known species distributions, or sediment disturbances difficult to explain quickly. Most of these observations eventually receive conventional explanations: gas releases, fish schools, underwater landslides, equipment interference. But the process takes time. During that interval, speculation grows. Speculation itself is not inherently negative. It can motivate research funding, public interest, and technological innovation. Problems arise only when speculation replaces evidence. The goal here remains balanced curiosity, acknowledging both known science and open questions without exaggeration. Geologically, ifs bay, actually correction. Geographical complexity extends across several basins within the lake. The central basin reaches the greatest depth. Fault lines beneath indicate active tectonic processes. Baikal sits within a continental rift zone where Earth's crust slowly pulls apart. Over millions of years, that rifting created space for deep water accumulation. Geological activity continues, though mostly at levels not felt strongly on the surface. Hydrothermal vents exist in certain deep sections. These vents release minerals, creating localized chemical gradients. Similar systems in oceans support unique biological communities. Baikal vents remain less studied, partly due to accessibility challenges. Potential exists for undiscovered microbial ecosystems adapted to those conditions. Sediment cores extracted from the lake floor provide climate records extending back millions of years. Layers contain pollen, microfossils, isotopic signatures. Researchers reconstruct past temperatures, vegetation patterns, even atmospheric composition indirectly. Few freshwater systems offer such continuous archives. All of this contributes to a broader picture. Baikal is not just deep water. It is a long-running natural laboratory where geology, biology, chemistry, and climate history intersect. That complexity makes definitive statements difficult. Each expedition answers some questions while generating new ones. And as attention gradually shifts from introductory context towards specific reports of unusual sightings, historical expeditions, and biological possibilities, the surface calm of the lake remains unchanged, while the discussion moves gently toward what people have claimed to encounter there over time, and how those claims intersect with modern scientific understanding without rushing to conclusions or dramatic endings. When people first hear the name Lake Baikal, the reaction is usually calm curiosity rather than excitement. It does not carry the immediate dramatic associations of the Mariana Trench or the Amazon rainforest. It sounds distant, almost quiet just in pronunciation. And in many ways that matches first impressions. Photographs often show smooth water, wide skies, forests along the shore, ice in winter that looks stable enough to walk across. At a glance, nothing suggests hidden complexity. Yet the more closely researchers examine it, the more unusual details begin to accumulate. Geographically, Lake Baikal sits in southeastern Siberia, primarily within Russia, north of Mongolia. The nearest major urban centre is Irkutsk, though even that city still leaves you hundreds of kilometres from some of the lake's most remote stretches. Distance matters here. Limited development has preserved much of the shoreline. Industrial pressure exists, but compared with many other large freshwater bodies, Baikal remains relatively intact. That relative isolation has allowed ecological processes to continue with less disruption than in heavily populated regions. Size becomes the first striking fact. The lake holds more fresh water than all the North American Great Lakes combined. That statistic sounds almost exaggerated until you consider depth. Maximum depth exceeds 1,600 metres. Average depth is also substantial, over 700 metres. Depth influences temperature stability, pressure conditions, oxygen distribution, And species adaptation. Shallow lakes behave differently. They warm quickly, mix more often, accumulate sediment faster. Baikal's depth slows those processes dramatically. Age follows naturally as the next key point. Geological evidence indicates roughly 25 million years of continuous existence. That makes Baikal the oldest known freshwater lake still retaining its original basin. Most lakes are geologically temporary. They form, fill with sediment, drain, or evaporate within tens of thousands of years. Baikal's rift setting prevents rapid infilling. The Earth's crust beneath continues to spread slowly, maintaining space for water accumulation. That rifting process remains active today. Minor seismic activity occurs periodically. Nothing typically catastrophic, but enough to remind geologists that the basin is not static. Underwater slopes shift occasionally. Sediment flows happen. These events sometimes register on instruments before anyone at the surface notices anything unusual. Water clarity frequently surprises visitors. On calm days, visibility can reach extraordinary distances compared with other freshwater bodies. Scientists attribute this to several factors. Cold temperatures limit microbial growth. Unique plankton species filter suspended particles efficiently. Limited agricultural runoff reduces nutrient overload. Together, these elements maintain clarity that seems almost oceanic. Clarity does not eliminate darkness at depth. Light penetration decreases steadily. Past a few hundred meters, natural illumination disappears completely. Cameras require artificial light. Artificial light introduces its own complications. Some animals avoid it. Others approach it. Behavior observed under illumination may not represent natural conditions accurately. Temperature structure also differs from many lakes. Surface layers warm modestly during summer. Deep water remains near 4 degrees Celsius year-round. That temperature corresponds to maximum density for freshwater. Stable density reduces vertical mixing. Reduced mixing influences nutrient cycles. Nutrients sinking from surface productivity take longer to re-enter upper layers. That creates ecological stratification. Oxygen availability, however, remains relatively high even at depth. Occasional mixing events, combined with cold water's ability to dissolve oxygen efficiently, prevent the deep anoxic zones common in some other deep lakes. That oxygen presence allows organisms to inhabit depths that might otherwise remain biologically sparse. Species diversity within Baikal is remarkable. More than half of known species there are endemic, meaning they exist nowhere else on Earth. Endemism arises when isolation persists long enough for evolution to produce distinct adaptations. Amphipods, small crustaceans, show exceptional diversification here. Some species occupy specific depth ranges, others specialize in particular substrates. A few reach sizes considerably larger than their relatives elsewhere. Fish fauna includes omal, a white fish valued both ecologically and economically. Fishing regulation has fluctuated over time due to population pressures. Conservation efforts aim to maintain sustainable levels. Another notable fish is the golomyanka, almost translucent, rich in oil, and adapted to deep cold water. Unlike many fish, it gives birth to lots of young. Its physiology supports buoyancy without a swim bladder. Then there is the Baikal seal, often mentioned because freshwater seals are rare globally. Genetic studies suggest marine ancestry. Hypotheses about its arrival involve ancient river connections to Arctic seas. The exact pathway remains debated. Regardless, the species demonstrates how long-term geological change can isolate marine lineages within freshwater systems. Human interaction with the lake spans thousands of years. Indigenous Buryat communities developed cultural traditions connected to the water. Folklore includes references to spirits, unusual presences, and protective forces associated with the lake. Such stories reflect respect for an environment both life-sustaining and unpredictable. Later, Russian expansion introduced scientific exploration alongside economic use. Early scientific expeditions in the 19th century focused on mapping shoreline, measuring depth, cataloguing species. Equipment limitations constrained findings. Lead lines measured depth slowly. Biological sampling relied on nets and dredges. Many deep habitats remained essentially untouched. 20th century research introduced sonar mapping, submersible vehicles, advanced chemical analysis. Even so, logistical challenges persisted. Siberian winters bring extreme cold. Ice thickness complicates deployment of heavy equipment. Summer storms can arise quickly. Transportation to remote research sites requires planning and resources. Technological improvements continue. Autonomous underwater vehicles now conduct surveys with minimal human presence. Remote sensors monitor temperature, oxygen, seismic activity. Satellite imagery assists with surface conditions. Yet full biological inventory remains incomplete. New species descriptions still appear regularly in scientific literature. Public fascination with hidden creatures often emerges whenever environments remain partially unexplored. Lake Baikal fits that pattern. Reports occasionally surface of large shapes beneath ice, unusual sonar readings, or unexpected disturbances. Most receive conventional explanations after investigation. Gas bubbles trapped under ice can distort light. Schools of fish create acoustic signatures. Sediment slides produce turbidity plumes. Still, the persistence of such reports keeps curiosity alive. Scientific caution does not eliminate imagination. Instead, it channels it toward testable questions. Could large undiscovered species exist? Possibly, though ecological constraints make certain sizes unlikely. Food availability, reproductive rates, and oxygen needs limit what ecosystems can support. Comparisons with other deep freshwater lakes help contextualize this. Lake Tanganyika in Africa also hosts endemic species in considerable depth. Similar evolutionary isolation occurs there, yet no verified giant unknown vertebrates have emerged despite extensive study. That does not close the door entirely, but it informs probability assessments. Sediment records from Baikal provide one of the longest continuous climate archives available from a freshwater environment. Core samples reveal past glacial cycles, vegetation changes, atmospheric dust patterns. These records assist global climate modelling. Few lakes contribute so extensively to paleoclimate understanding. Hydrothermal activity beneath certain basins adds another dimension. Mineral-rich vents create localized chemical gradients. Microbial communities may thrive there, similar in principle to oceanic hydrothermal ecosystems. Research remains ongoing due to technical difficulty reaching those depths safely. Hydrology also deserves attention. More than 300 rivers and streams feed Baikal. Only one river, the Angara, flows out. That inflow-outflow balance maintains water level stability over long periods. Seasonal variation occurs, but catastrophic fluctuations remain rare compared with some shallower lakes. Ice cover forms most winters, typically lasting from January through May. Ice thickness can exceed 1 metre. The frozen surface supports temporary transportation routes, research stations and cultural activities. Beneath the ice, however, water continues circulating slowly. Light penetration through clear ice supports limited photosynthesis even in winter. Acoustic conditions under ice sometimes amplify sounds. Cracking ice, gas releases and distant movements can travel long distances. Observers unfamiliar with such acoustics may interpret them as something more mysterious. Scientific monitoring has clarified many of these phenomena, though not all. Tourism has increased gradually. Visitors come for landscapes, wildlife observation, winter ice formations. Increased human presence brings economic benefits, but also environmental pressure. Waste management, shoreline development, and fishing practices require careful regulation to preserve ecological integrity. Pollution concerns have arisen periodically, particularly regarding nearby industrial facilities. Conservation groups advocate strict controls. Government policy has shifted over time. Current monitoring suggests overall water quality remains high compared with many global freshwater systems, though vigilance continues. Climate change introduces additional variables. Warming trends influence ice cover duration, water temperature stratification, and species distribution. Long-term data sets from Baikal provide valuable indicators of broader environmental shifts. Scientists monitor plankton communities closely because they respond quickly to temperature changes. As all these factors accumulate, the lake reveals itself not as a static body of water, but as a dynamic system shaped by geology, climate, biology, and human interaction. Its quiet surface conceals layers of complexity rather than dramatic unknown monsters waiting to emerge. Yet complexity itself often feels mysterious when observed gradually, and with that broader introduction settling into place, attention naturally begins drifting toward the lake's deeper history, the immense timescale over which it formed and evolved, because understanding that timeline makes later discussions about possible ancient lineages, unusual species persistence, and long-term ecological stability much easier to follow without rushing ahead too abruptly. When people hear that Lake Baikal is the oldest freshwater lake on Earth, the statement often sounds impressive but abstract. Age measured in millions of years does not translate easily into everyday experience. 10 years feels long in personal memory. A century already stretches imagination. 25 million years moves into a completely different category, one where normal reference points stop working. To understand what that age really implies, it helps to think not in exact numbers, but in sequences of events, changes unfolding gradually while the lake basin remained present through them all. Lake Baikal did not appear suddenly. Its origin lies in tectonic forces, specifically a continental rift zone where Earth's crust began slowly pulling apart. Similar processes formed the East African Rift System, though Baikal's development started much earlier. When crust stretches, it thins, faults form, sections drop downward, creating elongated depressions. Water eventually fills those depressions. In Baikal's case, the process never stopped completely. The basin continues widening by a few millimeters each year. That ongoing movement prevents the lake from filling with sediment the way most lakes eventually do. Sediment accumulation normally ends a lake's life. Rivers carry particles downhill. Those particles settle on lake bottoms. Over thousands of years, shallow water becomes marsh, then land. Baikal resists that fate because tectonic subsidence offsets sediment deposition. The floor keeps sinking slowly. Space remains available for water. Geological persistence follows. Researchers estimate initial rifting began around 25 million years ago, though exact timing varies slightly among studies. At that time, global climates differed substantially from today. Continents occupied slightly different positions. Mammalian evolution was still progressing toward many modern forms. Human ancestors had not yet appeared. While species came and went on land, the basin that would hold Baikal was already forming. Climate oscillations influenced the region repeatedly. Glacial cycles advanced and retreated. Ice sheets expanded across northern latitudes. Baikal's depth prevented complete freezing even during the coldest periods, though thick surface ice certainly formed. That continuity preserved aquatic ecosystems while nearby environments shifted dramatically. Fossil evidence extracted from sediment cores reveals environmental transitions. Pollen grains indicate vegetation types along the shore. Isotopic signatures reveal temperature fluctuations. Microfossils show plankton community changes. Each layer acts like a page in a chronological record. Scientists read those layers carefully, reconstructing climate history far beyond written human records. One important aspect of that long timeline is evolutionary opportunity. Isolation combined with stability allows species to diverge gradually. Many Baikal organisms trace ancestry to marine lineages that became trapped when ancient seaways receded. Others evolved entirely within freshwater conditions. Some display morphological traits considered primitive compared with relatives elsewhere, not because they stopped evolving, but because their environment favoured continuity over drastic change. The Baikal seal illustrates this well. Genetic analysis suggests distant marine ancestry, possibly linked to Arctic species. At some point, geological connections allowed migration into the basin. When those connections closed, isolation began. Over thousands of generations, the population adapted fully to freshwater life. Today it represents a unique branch of pinniped evolution. Fish lineages show similar patterns. Certain sculpin species diversified extensively within the lake. Many occupy narrow ecological niches. Some live only at specific depths. Others specialise in particular feeding strategies. That diversification resembles island evolution, except the island is a deep freshwater basin rather than land surrounded by ocean. Sediment thickness beneath Baikal reaches several kilometers in places. That depth means the lake has stored enormous amounts of historical data. Drilling projects retrieve cores carefully to avoid contamination. Each extracted segment undergoes chemical, biological and physical analysis. Dating techniques include radiometric methods, magnetic reversals, and stratigraphic correlation. Magnetic reversals deserve brief explanation because they provide useful chronological markers. Earth's magnetic field flips polarity irregularly over geological time. Minerals settling in sediments align with the prevailing field orientation. When scientists detect reversals in core samples, they correlate them with known global reversal timelines. That helps refine age estimates. Another dating approach examines diatom fossils. Diatoms are microscopic algae with silica shells. Different species dominate under different environmental conditions. Their remains accumulate in sediments. Identifying species sequences provides additional chronological clues. These methods collectively confirm Baikal's extraordinary age compared with most lakes. They also reveal environmental continuity interrupted occasionally by significant shifts, such as volcanic ash deposition from distant eruptions or abrupt climate transitions. Volcanic influence deserves mention. Siberia experienced major volcanic episodes in deep geological time, including the Siberian Traps event around 252 million years ago, though that predates Baikal itself. Later regional volcanic activity occasionally deposited ash layers into the basin. Those layers form distinct markers within sediment sequences. Tectonic activity continues shaping shoreline morphology. Fault movements create steep underwater slopes. Subaqueous landslides occur sporadically. Instruments record these events even when surface disturbance remains minimal. Such geological dynamism coexists with long-term basin stability, an interesting balance. Hydrological continuity also contributes to ecosystem persistence. More than 300 tributaries supply fresh water. Seasonal snowmelt, rainfall patterns, and groundwater inputs maintain volume. The Angara River outflow regulates level gradually rather than abruptly. That steady turnover prevents stagnation while preserving overall stability. Human presence arrived relatively recently on this timeline. Archaeological evidence indicates settlement around the lake thousands of years ago, still a brief moment compared with millions of years of geological history. Indigenous communities developed sustainable practices tied closely to seasonal cycles. Fishing, hunting, and spiritual traditions reflected respect for environmental rhythms. Russian scientific exploration accelerated in the 18th and 19th centuries. Early naturalists documented species, shoreline features, and climate conditions. Equipment limitations restricted deep investigation. Nonetheless, foundational knowledge accumulated steadily. 20th century expeditions introduced sonar mapping, deep water sampling devices, and later submersibles. Each technological improvement revealed additional complexity. Previously unknown species emerged. Geological understanding refined. Climate reconstruction advanced. Even with modern technology, full comprehension remains incomplete. depth alone imposes constraints. Pressure at 1,600 meters exceeds 150 atmospheres. Equipment must withstand those forces reliably. Remote operation reduces risk but introduces technical challenges. Biological sampling at depth also faces difficulties. Nets disturb fragile organisms. Cameras require lighting that alters behavior. Autonomous vehicles mitigate some issues but cannot eliminate them entirely. As a result, certain ecological niches remain poorly documented. The concept of prehistoric survival often arises from this incomplete knowledge. When species exhibit ancient traits or occupy long isolated environments, public imagination sometimes extends that into the possibility of undiscovered large vertebrates. Scientific evaluation considers ecological feasibility, food supply, reproductive viability, habitat capacity. Baikal's productivity, while sufficient for its current ecosystems, does not suggest abundant resources for very large unknown predators. Cold temperatures slow metabolism. Energy transfer efficiency decreases with each trophic level. That does not preclude undiscovered species entirely, but it constrains expectations regarding size and population density. Historical accounts occasionally mention unusual sightings. Travellers reported large moving shadows under ice or unexpected disturbances offshore. Many such reports lack corroborating evidence. Optical distortions under ice, gas releases, and fish aggregations offer plausible explanations. Nonetheless, documentation continues because unusual observations sometimes lead to legitimate discoveries. Acoustic monitoring has detected unexplained sounds periodically. Further analysis often attributes them to ice movement, seismic microactivity, or biological sources not initially identified. Continuous monitoring improves interpretation accuracy over time. Climate change introduces new variables affecting long-term stability. Shorter ice cover duration alters light penetration patterns. Surface temperature shifts influence plankton dynamics. Researchers watch these changes closely because they can cascade through food webs. Sediment cores already show past climate variability exceeding recent observations, reminding scientists that natural fluctuation is part of the system. Distinguishing anthropogenic influence from natural cycles requires careful analysis across multiple datasets. Conservation efforts aim to maintain water quality and biodiversity. Pollution control, fishing regulation, and tourism management all play roles. International recognition of Baikal's significance supports protective policies, though enforcement challenges persist. Educational outreach also matters. Public understanding encourages responsible behaviour. When people appreciate the lake's age and uniqueness, support for conservation tends to increase. Documentaries, scientific publications, and local programs contribute to that awareness. As the idea of geological time settles in, the lake begins to feel less like a static feature and more like an ongoing process. 25 million years represents not just duration but continuity through change. Ecosystems adapted, species emerged and disappeared, climates shifted, tectonic forces persisted. And with that extended timeline in mind, attention naturally begins moving toward physical structure itself, the immense depth, darkness, and isolation that shape conditions beneath the surface. Because understanding those environmental constraints helps clarify what kinds of organisms can realistically inhabit such an ancient and unusually deep freshwater system without jumping prematurely into speculation. When people first learn how deep Lake Baikal really is, the number often sounds impressive but still abstract. Numbers on their own rarely capture physical reality. Saying over 1,600 meters may register intellectually, yet the human mind is not accustomed to imagining vertical freshwater space of that magnitude. Most lakes people encounter are shallow enough that depth changes feel gradual. In Baikal, the transition can be abrupt. Shorelines in some places drop sharply. A short distance from land, water depth already exceeds what many coastal seas reach. Depth influences almost every environmental condition beneath the surface. Pressure increases steadily. Roughly every 10 meters of water adds another atmosphere of pressure. At maximum depth in Baikal, pressure surpasses 160 atmospheres. That means organisms living there experience forces far beyond what surface species encounter. Adaptation becomes essential rather than optional. Darkness follows quickly after depth. Sunlight penetrates water only to a limited extent. Even in Baikal's exceptionally clear water, illumination fades substantially within the first few dozen meters. By several hundred meters, natural light effectively disappears. The deep basin remains in continuous darkness regardless of day or night above. For organisms living there, vision plays a reduced role compared with other senses. Temperature remains consistently cold. Deep Baikal water stays near 4 degrees Celsius year-round. That temperature corresponds to freshwater's maximum density, which is why deep layers remain stable. Surface warming during summer does not significantly alter deep conditions. Winter ice cover insulates rather than freezes the entire volume. Cold water holds dissolved oxygen efficiently. Unlike some deep lakes where bottom layers become oxygen depleted, Baikal maintains oxygen at considerable depth. Occasional mixing events, driven by seasonal changes or geological disturbances, help sustain that oxygen distribution. That availability allows animals to inhabit depths where many other freshwater systems would become inhospitable. Isolation emerges not only from depth, but also from geography. Lake Baikal sits far from oceanic influence, surrounded by mountain ranges and vast Siberian landscapes. Tributary rivers connect it to regional hydrology, yet direct marine exchange ceased long ago. Biological immigration slowed dramatically once geological barriers solidified. Evolution proceeded largely within the basin itself. Isolation influences genetic divergence. Populations separated long enough accumulate distinct traits. Over thousands or millions of years, those differences can produce entirely new species. Baikal exemplifies this process. Many organisms there exist nowhere else, because they evolved under conditions not replicated elsewhere. Darkness alters sensory priorities. Deepwater fish often display reduced eyesight. Some possess enlarged lateral line systems to detect vibration. Others rely on chemical cues in the water. Certain crustaceans exhibit elongated antennae. Energy conservation becomes critical. Producing large visual organs in permanent darkness offers little advantage. Food availability shapes community structure. Sunlight drives primary production in surface waters through photosynthesis. Organic matter sinks gradually. Deep organisms depend partly on that marine snow equivalent in fresh water. Hydrothermal vents and microbial processes may supplement energy locally, though research continues to quantify their contribution. Metabolic rates generally decrease in cold environments. Slow growth, delayed reproduction, and extended lifespans often result. Some Baikal amphipods illustrate this pattern. They grow larger than typical relatives, yet do so slowly. Longevity increases. Such life history strategies suit stable, but resource-limited habitats. Sediment layers on the lake floor accumulate gradually. Fine particles settle continuously. Occasional underwater landslides redistribute material along slopes. Instruments have recorded turbidity currents triggered by seismic activity. These events reshape local habitats without necessarily affecting the entire basin. Submersible explorations have provided direct visual confirmation of deep habitats. Footage shows relatively sparse biological density compared with surface zones. Organisms appear adapted to minimal disturbance. Artificial lights sometimes attract curious individuals, though researchers interpret such behavior cautiously. Sound behaves differently underwater than in air. Low-frequency sounds travel long distances. Ice cover during winter further modifies acoustic properties. Cracking ice, gas releases, and seismic micro-events produce sounds unfamiliar to untrained listeners. Some earlier reports of mysterious noises likely stem from these natural processes. Human exploration of such depths remains technically demanding. Pressure-resistant vessels, remote-operated vehicles, and specialized sensors are required. Equipment failure risk increases with depth. Recovery operations can be complex. Each expedition involves careful planning, redundancy systems, and environmental monitoring. Technological progress gradually expands observational capacity. High-definition cameras, autonomous vehicles, and advanced sonar mapping reveal more detail than earlier expeditions could achieve. Still, complete coverage remains unrealistic in the near term due to scale, cost, and environmental challenges. Comparisons with oceanic deep zones help contextualize Baikal's environment. While not as deep as major ocean trenches, the lake's freshwater chemistry creates distinct ecological dynamics. Saltwater density differences, circulation patterns, and nutrient cycles differ substantially. Direct analogies therefore require caution. One interesting aspect involves hydrothermal vents discovered in certain deep regions. These vents release mineral-rich fluids. Microbial communities potentially utilize chemical energy rather than sunlight. Similar processes sustain life near oceanic vents. Research continues to determine the extent of such ecosystems in Baikal. Gas hydrate deposits have also attracted attention. Methane trapped within sediments occasionally escapes. Gas bubbles rising through water columns can create unusual surface disturbances. Under ice, trapped gas can refract light oddly. Such phenomena sometimes contribute to anecdotal observations interpreted initially as biological. Visibility at depth remains limited even with artificial lighting. Suspended particles scatter light. Camera range decreases. Observational bias becomes inevitable. Scientists account for this by combining visual data with acoustic, chemical, and physical measurements. Bioluminescence, common in marine deep environments, appears less prevalent in Baikal. Some microorganisms may exhibit faint luminescence, though documentation remains sparse. Absence of widespread bioluminescence further emphasizes reliance on non-visual sensory mechanisms. Currents within the lake, though generally gentle compared with ocean currents, influence nutrient distribution. Wind-driven surface movement occasionally induces deeper circulation. Temperature gradients contribute modestly. Understanding these patterns assists ecological modelling. Shoreline morphology affects sediment input. Steep rocky coasts contribute differently from river deltas. Seasonal freeze-thaw cycles influence erosion rates. Human development alters runoff patterns locally, prompting conservation monitoring. Ice cover itself constitutes a unique environmental phase. Light transmission through clear ice allows limited photosynthesis below. Snow cover reduces that light significantly. Ice thickness influences gas exchange between water and atmosphere. Researchers study these dynamics carefully because climate change may alter ice duration. Thermal stability in deep layers means organisms experience less seasonal fluctuation than surface species. Predictability favors specialized adaptations. Sudden environmental shifts when they occur may therefore have pronounced effects. Ecological niches partition along depth gradients. Some fish remain in upper layers, others occupy mid-depth zones. A few specialize in deep habitats exclusively. Vertical migration patterns exist but differ from marine systems due to freshwater density characteristics. Predation pressure decreases with depth generally. Energy constraints limit large predator populations. Smaller opportunistic feeders dominate. Scavenging plays a significant role in nutrient recycling. Dead organic material descending from above becomes valuable resource. Microbial communities perform essential chemical transformations. They decompose organic matter, recycle nutrients, and influence oxygen dynamics. Advanced molecular techniques continue revealing previously unknown microbial diversity. Isolation also affects disease dynamics. Pathogens present elsewhere may never reach Baikal populations. Conversely, introduced species could disrupt existing balances dramatically. Strict biosecurity measures aim to minimize accidental introductions. Historical climate shifts occasionally altered lake level modestly. Shoreline terraces visible today reflect past stands. Sediment analysis correlates those changes with broader regional climatic patterns. Geological surveys indicate the rift basin may deepen further over long timescales. That possibility reinforces Baikal's status as an evolving geological feature rather than a static lake. Public fascination with deep environments often gravitates toward dramatic possibilities. While scientific evidence favours modestly sized endemic species rather than giant unknown vertebrates, the sense of hidden complexity persists. Depth naturally evokes curiosity. Education initiatives attempt to balance wonder with accuracy. Documentaries highlight unique biodiversity without exaggeration. Research institutions collaborate internationally, sharing data to refine understanding. As awareness grows, conservation urgency increases. Protecting such an ancient and unique ecosystem requires sustained effort. Pollution control, responsible tourism, and scientific funding all contribute. And with the physical environment of depth, darkness, and isolation now clearer, attention begins to shift gradually toward how organisms actually adapted to those conditions over millions of years, because examining biological specialization provides context for evaluating whether ancient lineages might plausibly persist there without relying on sensational interpretations. When researchers talk about Lake Baikal as a place of unique evolution, they are usually referring to one simple but striking statistic. A very large proportion of its species exist nowhere else on Earth. In scientific terms, they are endemic. Endemism happens whenever isolation lasts long enough for populations to adapt specifically to their environment, without ongoing genetic exchange with outside relatives. Oceans show this on islands. Mountain ranges show it in valleys separated by altitude. And deep lakes, especially very old ones, provide another version of that evolutionary laboratory. Lake Baikal's age plays a central role here. 25 million years gives evolution plenty of time to experiment. Species do not appear suddenly. They change gradually. Small variations accumulate. Environmental pressures favour certain traits. Over many generations, populations diverge until they become distinct species. When isolation continues, those species may diversify further. Baikal has offered exactly those conditions: stability combined with separation. One of the most commonly discussed examples involves amphipods. These are small crustaceans, relatives of shrimp in a broad sense, usually only a few millimeters long in most freshwater systems. In Baikal, however, amphipods show extraordinary diversity. Hundreds of species inhabit different depth zones, substrates, and feeding niches. Some remain small. Others grow surprisingly large compared with relatives elsewhere, occasionally reaching several centimeters. Cold water contributes to that size variation. Lower temperatures slow metabolism, which can allow certain invertebrates to grow larger over longer lifespans. Oxygen availability also helps. Baikal's deep waters retain dissolved oxygen, supporting organisms that might otherwise struggle in oxygen-poor depths. Morphological differences among Baikal amphipods reflect their ecological roles. Some have elongated appendages suited for swimming in open water. Others possess stronger claws adapted for scavenging on the lake floor. Certain species display enhanced sensory structures, likely compensating for darkness at depth. None of these traits appeared overnight. They represent gradual evolutionary responses to specific environmental pressures. Fish diversity tells a similar story. The sculpin family, for instance, underwent significant radiation within the lake. Sculpins generally are bottom-dwelling fish with broad heads and tapering bodies. In Baikal, dozens of species occupy various habitats, from shallow rocky areas to deep, soft sediments. Some species remain relatively small. Others adapted to deeper environments show reduced pigmentation, softer skeleton structures, and physiological traits suited to pressure. The Golomyanka fish stands out because of its unusual characteristics. Its body appears almost translucent. High oil content provides buoyancy. It lacks a swim bladder, a feature common in many fish for regulating depth. Instead, lipid composition performs that function. It also gives birth to live young rather than laying eggs. That reproductive strategy may improve survival in cold, stable environments where egg development could face challenges. Researchers note that Golomyanka populations form a significant component of the lake's biomass, despite rarely being seen near the surface. Their vertical distribution varies, with some individuals inhabiting mid-depth zones while others descend deeper. Predators such as the Baikal seal rely partly on them as food. Speaking of seals, the Baikal seal, or Nurpa, often captures public attention precisely because freshwater seals are rare globally. Genetic evidence indicates distant marine ancestry. Geological history suggests that at some point, ancient waterways allowed migration from Arctic seas into the Baikal basin. When connections closed, isolation began. Over time, physiological adjustments enabled full freshwater adaptation. Nurpa behaviour differs somewhat from marine seals. Ice cover patterns influence breeding habits. Food sources consist primarily of endemic fish species. Their thick blubber helps maintain body temperature in cold water. Scientists continue studying their population dynamics because environmental changes could affect long-term viability. Microbial life within Baikal also deserves attention. While less visible than fish or seals, microorganisms form the foundation of aquatic ecosystems. Unique bacterial and algal species inhabit various layers, including hydrothermal vent zones, where chemical energy supplements sunlight-driven production. Molecular analysis techniques continue revealing previously unknown lineages. Diatoms, microscopic algae with silica shells, display extensive diversity in Baikal. Their fossilized remains in sediment cores help reconstruct past environmental conditions. Different species dominate under different temperature, nutrient, and light regimes. Their evolutionary history within the lake reflects climate fluctuations over millions of years. Sponges present another interesting case. Freshwater sponges exist elsewhere, but Baikal hosts several endemic species forming large colonies on submerged rocks. Some appear bright green due to symbiotic algae living within their tissues. These symbioses benefit both partners. Algae gain protection and nutrients, while sponges receive photosynthetic products. Winter ice conditions influence these sponge communities. Light penetration through clear ice allows continued photosynthesis. Snow cover variability affects productivity levels. Climate-driven changes in ice duration could therefore impact sponge ecology indirectly. Invertebrate worms, mollusks, and insect larvae also show endemic diversity. Many species lusks display shell forms adapted to specific substrates. Some inhabit sandy bottoms, others attach to rocks. Evolutionary divergence reflects habitat specialization rather than dramatic morphological novelty. Isolation does not mean complete evolutionary stagnation. Environmental pressures continue shaping species. Climate variation, tectonic shifts, and ecological interactions all drive ongoing change. However, because Baikal remained a lake for so long without drying out or connecting broadly to oceans, evolutionary trajectories there differ from those in younger freshwater systems. Comparisons with other ancient lakes reinforce this pattern. Lake Tanganyika in Africa, another very old rift lake, also exhibits high endemism. Similar processes operate: long-term stability, geographic isolation, depth stratification. Studying multiple ancient lakes helps scientists understand how biodiversity develops over geological timescales. One misconception worth clarifying involves the word prehistoric. In popular usage, it often implies unchanged survivors from distant eras. Scientifically, evolution never truly stops. Even lineages retaining ancient structural features continue adapting genetically. So Baikal species are not living fossils in the strict sense. They are modern organisms shaped by ancient environments. Nevertheless, their ancestry sometimes extends far back. Genetic analyses can trace divergence times. Some Baikal lineages separated from relatives millions of years ago. That temporal depth contributes to their uniqueness. Environmental constraints also limit species size. Cold temperatures slow metabolism. Energy availability restricts large predator populations. While amphipods may grow larger than usual, truly giant unknown vertebrates remain biologically unlikely based on current ecological understanding. Still, incomplete exploration leaves room for smaller undiscovered species. Technological advances continue improving detection methods. Environmental DNA sampling allows scientists to identify species presence from genetic traces in water samples without capturing organisms directly. Early results confirm known biodiversity, while occasionally hinting at previously undocumented genetic signatures requiring further investigation. Hydroacoustic surveys map fish distributions more accurately than older net-based approaches. Combined with remote cameras and autonomous vehicles, these tools gradually reduce knowledge gaps. Yet the scale of the lake ensures that research remains an ongoing process rather than a completed project. Human activity introduces additional variables. Fishing pressure, pollution risk, and climate change all influence evolutionary trajectories. Conservation policies aim to minimize negative impacts. Maintaining water quality remains essential because endemic species often possess narrow tolerance ranges. Public interest sometimes focuses on the possibility of hidden large creatures, while evidence for such organisms remains lacking. The broader reality of unique endemic biodiversity often proves equally fascinating scientifically. Understanding how isolation shapes life offers insights applicable far beyond a single lake. Educational outreach emphasizes that protecting Baikal preserves not only individual species, but also an evolutionary process spanning millions of years. Losing endemic species would erase genetic information accumulated over vast timescales. Research collaboration across countries enhances understanding. International teams contribute expertise in geology, biology, chemistry, and climate science. Shared data accelerate discovery while supporting conservation strategies. Tourism, when managed responsibly, can foster appreciation. Visitors witnessing clear water, winter ice formations, and endemic wildlife often become advocates for preservation. Balancing economic benefit with ecological protection remains an ongoing challenge. As knowledge accumulates, Baikal increasingly appears less mysterious in a sensational sense, yet more impressive scientifically. Unique evolution there illustrates how time, isolation, and environmental stability interact. Each endemic species represents a long evolutionary narrative continuing today, and with that sense of biological uniqueness settling in, attention begins drifting naturally toward the cultural side of the lake as well, because alongside scientific discoveries there have always been human stories, folklore and local traditions describing unusual presences in the water, narratives that developed long before modern research began documenting the ecosystem systematically. When people live beside a body of water for generations, stories almost always develop. Lakes, rivers and seas tend to gather folklore the same way they gather sediment, slowly, layer by layer. Some stories begin as simple cautionary tales. Others grow from unusual natural events that lacked explanation at the time. Over years, those observations blend with imagination, cultural beliefs, and the human tendency to fill gaps with narrative. Lake Baikal is no exception. Long before sonar mapping, submersibles, or modern biology, the communities living along its shores already had their own ways of understanding what lay beneath the surface. Indigenous Buryat traditions include references to spirits associated with the lake. These are not always described as physical animals in the modern sense. Often they are guardians, forces of nature, or presences meant to command respect. Water, particularly deep cold water, carries obvious risk. Fishing accidents, sudden storms, and ice breakage would have been familiar dangers. Framing those hazards through spiritual narratives helped transmit caution across generations. Some oral traditions mention large unseen beings moving beneath the water. The descriptions vary widely. In some versions, the presence is protective, almost a caretaker of the lake. In others, it represents a warning against arrogance or reckless behaviour. These differences reflect cultural priorities rather than consistent zoological observation. Folklore adapts to social needs as much as environmental experience. Russian explorers arriving in the 17th and 18th centuries recorded occasional local stories. Travel journals mention fishermen reluctant to venture into certain areas, especially during particular seasons. Interpreting those accounts requires care. Hesitation may have arisen from known hazards, such as unpredictable winds, thin ice zones, or difficult navigation rather than belief in literal monsters. Still, once written down, such references often gained new life. Readers unfamiliar with local conditions sometimes interpreted them more dramatically than intended. A note about strange movements under ice could easily shift into speculation about unknown creatures, especially in eras when many parts of the world remained poorly mapped. 19th century scientific expeditions occasionally encountered similar anecdotal reports. Naturalists collecting specimens sometimes heard fishermen describe large shadows or unexpected disturbances. Without reliable optical equipment, interpreting underwater movement proved difficult. Light refraction through ice and water can distort perception significantly. Even today, divers occasionally misjudge object size or distance under unusual lighting conditions. Winter conditions around Baikal contribute strongly to these perceptions. The lake freezes extensively. Clear ice allows visibility into the water below, but optical distortion remains significant. Gas bubbles trapped under ice create patterns resembling movement. Cracks propagate with loud sounds. Pressure ridges shift. For observers without scientific explanation, these phenomena could easily appear animate. Acoustic effects also play a role. Sound travels efficiently through ice and water. Distant events may seem closer than they are. Low-frequency vibrations sometimes resonate through the frozen surface. Early inhabitants, lacking modern acoustic theory, naturally interpreted such sounds through available cultural frameworks. Storm behaviour adds another dimension. Sudden winds can generate waves quickly despite the lake's inland location. Boats caught unexpectedly may experience violent motion. Survivors describing the event might emphasize unseen forces below rather than atmospheric conditions above. Over time, retellings simplify complex weather dynamics into more memorable imagery. Folklore also reflects social cohesion. Shared stories create identity. They help communities distinguish themselves from outsiders. Narratives about unique lake beings reinforce the sense that Baikal is special, deserving respect. Such storytelling functions culturally even when not intended as literal natural history. Modern tourism sometimes amplifies these legends. Visitors often enjoy mystery narratives. Local businesses occasionally reference traditional stories to create atmosphere. Responsible guides usually clarify the distinction between folklore and scientific evidence, though the boundary can blur in casual conversation. Scientific interest in folklore is not dismissive. Anthropologists study how environmental experience shapes narrative. Folklore may encode practical knowledge indirectly. Stories warning against certain areas might correspond to hazardous currents or unstable ice. Interpreting those connections requires interdisciplinary collaboration. Comparisons with other lakes reveal similar patterns. Scotland's Loch Ness, Canada's Okanagan Lake, and several Scandinavian lakes all have creature legends, most developed before detailed scientific surveys. Each reflects local environmental conditions combined with cultural storytelling traditions. Psychology also contributes. Humans evolve to detect potential threats quickly. Ambiguous stimuli often receive cautious interpretation. In low visibility environments like deep water, that bias strengthens. Seeing movement without clear identification naturally triggers speculation. Memory plays its part too. Retelling experiences alters details gradually. Emphasis shifts toward the unusual. Ordinary explanations fade. Over decades, a simple sighting of a large fish might transform into a more dramatic account. This does not imply dishonesty, only normal cognitive processing. Photography introduced new variables in the 20th century. Occasional images claimed to show unusual shapes on Baikal's surface, or beneath ice circulated locally. Most proved inconclusive upon closer examination. Reflections, wave patterns, or camera artifacts explained many cases. Nonetheless, images sustain interest because visual material feels persuasive even when ambiguous. Scientific expeditions sometimes use public reports as informal leads. If multiple independent observers describe unusual activity in a specific area, researchers may investigate. Most outcomes confirm known phenomena, but occasionally new ecological insights emerge, such as previously undocumented fish aggregations. The distinction between folklore and biological possibility remains important. Folklore reflects human interpretation. Biology requires reproducible evidence. Respecting cultural narratives while maintaining scientific standards allows both perspectives to coexist without conflict. Educational outreach increasingly incorporates this balanced approach. Museums near Baikal present local legends alongside ecological information. Visitors learn cultural history while understanding environmental science. This integration fosters appreciation without promoting misinformation. Climate change introduces subtle shifts that may influence future folklore development. Changes in ice duration, fish distribution, or storm patterns could generate new unusual observations. Communities will likely interpret those experiences through both scientific explanation and traditional narrative frameworks. Digital communication accelerates story spread today. Social media allows rapid sharing of unusual sightings. Verification sometimes lags behind dissemination. Scientists occasionally engage directly online to clarify observations. Public science communication thus becomes part of modern folklore evolution. Interestingly, even researchers occasionally experience moments of uncertainty in the field. Unexpected instrument readings or unusual animal behavior require careful investigation. Scientific method emphasizes patience precisely because first impressions can mislead. Historical continuity links present curiosity with past storytelling. While modern technology reduces mystery in some respects, the fundamental human fascination with deep water remains. That fascination drives both scientific exploration and cultural narrative, and as attention gradually shifts from folklore toward documented scientific exploration, it becomes natural to look at the early expeditions that first attempted systematic study of Baikal's depths, because understanding how investigation began helps clarify what evidence exists and what questions still remain open without leaning too heavily on either legend or speculation. Long before sonar screens, remotely operated vehicles and digital sensors, the first scientific attempts to understand Lake Baikal began in a far quieter, slower way. Early explorers did not arrive expecting monsters or dramatic discoveries. Most came with notebooks, measuring lines, jars for specimens, and a determination to document what they saw carefully. Their work unfolded gradually, often in difficult conditions, yet those early observations laid the groundwork for everything researchers know today about the lake's depths. Interest in Baikal intensified during the 18th century as Russian expansion moved eastward across Siberia. Administrators, naturalists, and surveyors were tasked with mapping newly incorporated territories. Geography came first. Knowing where rivers flowed, where mountains rose, and how large the lake actually was mattered for transportation, trade, and governance. Early maps were rough, but improved steadily as expeditions returned with better measurements. Depth measurement in those early years relied on simple lead lines. A weighted rope lowered from a boat provided approximate readings. The process was slow. Each measurement required calm water, careful positioning and patience. Errors were common. Still, repeated readings gradually revealed that Baikal was unusually deep compared with other lakes known at the time. That realization alone sparked scientific curiosity. Natural history collections followed. Researchers gathered fish, invertebrates, plants, and sediment samples where possible. Preservation methods were basic compared with modern standards, yet enough specimens survived transport back to research centres to allow classification. Early taxonomists began recognising that many Baikal species differed from known European freshwater organisms. Winter expeditions introduced a different set of opportunities and challenges. Thick ice allowed stable platforms for drilling holes directly above deep water. Researchers could lower sampling equipment vertically without boat drift. Cold temperatures, however, complicated equipment handling. Frostbite risk was constant. Mechanical components sometimes failed due to ice formation. Despite those hardships, winter sampling produced valuable insights. Water temperature profiles showed remarkable stability at depth. Dissolved oxygen measurements indicated unexpected levels even far below the surface. Those findings challenged assumptions derived from shallower European lakes, where deep water often becomes oxygen poor. The 19th century saw more systematic scientific involvement. Universities and academies sponsored dedicated expeditions rather than incidental surveys. One major development involved the establishment of research stations near the lake. Permanent or semi-permanent facilities allowed longer observation periods rather than brief visits. Researchers began studying seasonal cycles in more detail. Ice formation timing, plankton blooms, fish migrations, and water chemistry variations all became subjects of investigation. The realization emerged that Baikal functioned as a complex ecosystem rather than simply a large body of water. Instrumentation improved gradually. Thermometers designed for deep water provided more accurate temperature readings. Chemical analysis techniques advanced, allowing better understanding of mineral content and oxygen distribution. Microscopes revealed microbial life previously invisible to the naked eye. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a turning point with the introduction of early acoustic-sounding techniques. Primitive echo-sounding devices allowed depth measurement without lowering lines repeatedly. Accuracy improved, mapping accelerated. Scientists began visualizing the basin's three major sub-basins rather than imagining a uniform bottom. Biological dredging equipment also advanced. Nets designed for deeper deployment captured organisms previously unreachable. Amphipod diversity became apparent during this period. Researchers noted morphological differences suggesting specialized adaptation to depth zones. Scientific communication expanded as well. Published reports circulated internationally. European naturalists compared Baikal findings with African rift lakes, North American freshwater systems. Recognition grew that Baikal represented a unique evolutionary environment. Political and economic changes occasionally interrupted research continuity. Wars, funding shortages, and logistical difficulties affected expedition frequency. Nevertheless, interest persisted because the lake's scientific importance remained clear. The early 20th century introduced motorized vessels capable of supporting more complex equipment. Larger research boats allowed heavier sampling gear, improved storage for specimens, and more stable working conditions. Navigation across the lake became faster and safer compared with sail-powered predecessors. Hydrographic surveys expanded. Researchers mapped shoreline morphology, underwater slopes, and sediment distribution patterns. Geological interest increased once scientists recognized Baikal's tectonic rift origin. Understanding basin formation became a multidisciplinary effort, involving geologists, hydrologists, and biologists. Seismic monitoring began in rudimentary form as well. Instruments detected minor tectonic movements associated with the rift system. These observations confirmed that geological activity continued beneath the lake, rather than belonging solely to distant past events. Public fascination sometimes accompanied scientific reporting. Newspaper articles summarized expedition findings for general audiences. Occasionally, ambiguous observations received exaggerated interpretation. Scientists typically responded cautiously, emphasizing evidence over speculation. One important development involved sediment coring. Early corers extracted relatively shallow samples compared with modern drilling capabilities, but even those revealed layered environmental history. Fossil pollen, microalgae shells, and mineral variations indicated long-term climate fluctuation. International collaboration increased gradually. Scientists from different countries participated in joint studies, sharing expertise and equipment. Such collaboration accelerated progress while broadening perspectives on interpretation. Technological limitations still constrained deep exploration. Direct visual observation of the deepest zones remained impossible. Researchers relied on indirect data, acoustic readings, dredged specimens, and chemical profiles. Full understanding awaited later submersible technology. The mid-20th century saw the introduction of more sophisticated sonar systems. Detailed bathymetric maps emerged, showing complex underwater topography including ridges, slopes, and deep depressions. These maps confirmed Baikal's status as the deepest freshwater lake conclusively. Biological discoveries continued. New species descriptions appeared regularly in scientific literature. Some organisms previously thought rare turned out to be abundant once appropriate sampling techniques developed. Others remained elusive, sustaining scientific curiosity without invoking sensational explanations. Hydrological studies examined inflow and outflow dynamics more closely. River contributions, evaporation rates, and water residence time estimates refined understanding of the lake's overall balance. These insights informed conservation planning later. Cold War geopolitical conditions influenced research access somewhat, but scientific exchange never ceased entirely. Environmental significance transcended political boundaries. International conferences included Baikal findings alongside other global freshwater studies. By the late 20th century, manned submersibles finally enabled direct observation of deep habitats. Those missions confirmed many earlier hypotheses while correcting some assumptions. Observers documented amphipod communities, sediment characteristics, and hydrothermal vent activity visually for the first time. Data integration became increasingly sophisticated. Geological, biological, chemical, and climatic information combined into comprehensive ecosystem models. Such models continue evolving today as new measurements accumulate. Throughout this historical progression, one consistent theme emerges: understanding grew incrementally. No single expedition solved every mystery. Each contributed pieces. That cumulative approach defined scientific exploration generally, and Baikal research specifically. Educational outreach also expanded alongside research. Museums, documentaries, and academic programs disseminated findings beyond specialist circles. Public appreciation of Baikal shifted from vague curiosity toward informed respect for its ecological and geological significance. Conservation awareness followed naturally. Recognizing the lake's age, biodiversity, and scientific value encouraged protective measures. Pollution control initiatives, fishing regulations, and tourism guidelines developed partly in response to scientific evidence gathered over decades. Even now, early expedition records remain valuable. Long-term data sets allow comparison across time, helping detect environmental trends. Historical baseline information proves essential when assessing climate change effects or human impact. And as this historical overview settles into place, attention begins moving naturally towards specific organisms, first documented during those early explorations, particularly unusual invertebrates and fish that seem to bridge ancient evolutionary periods with modern ecosystems, because examining those species helps clarify how Baikal's long isolation shaped its present biological community without resorting to dramatic interpretations. A scientific exploration of Lake Baikal gradually moved from mapping and basic sampling toward closer biological observation. Certain organisms began attracting particular attention, not because they were dramatic in size or danger, but because they seemed to connect present ecosystems with much older environmental conditions. Among these were amphipods, small crustaceans that in most freshwater systems pass largely unnoticed, along with several fish and invertebrate species whose evolutionary histories appear to stretch back to periods when global climates and landscapes looked very different from today. Amphipods elsewhere are typically modest in scale. Many freshwater species measure only a few millimeters. They live among sediments, vegetation, or rocky substrates, feeding on organic debris, algae, and microorganisms. In Lake Baikal, however, amphipods display an unusual range of forms and sizes. Some remain small, but others grow several centimeters long, which makes them appear striking compared with relatives from other lakes. Size alone does not make them prehistoric, but it does prompt investigation into the environmental factors supporting that growth. Cold water plays a central role. Lower temperatures slow metabolic rates. Growth may continue over longer periods without the rapid aging seen in warmer environments. Baikal's deep water remains consistently cold year-round, providing stable conditions that favour gradual growth strategies. Oxygen availability reinforces this. Unlike many deep lakes where bottom waters become oxygen poor, Baikal retains dissolved oxygen even at considerable depth. That allows amphipods and other invertebrates to occupy ecological niches that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Pressure tolerance also matters. Amphipods living at depth have physiological adaptations that stabilize cellular structures under high pressure. Their exoskeleton composition differs subtly from shallow water relatives. Membrane chemistry adjusts to maintain flexibility. These changes developed over many generations, not abruptly, reflecting steady environmental pressures. Diversity within Baikal amphipods extends beyond size. Researchers have documented hundreds of species, each adapted to particular depth zones, substrates, and feeding strategies. Some species swim actively in open water. Others remain closely associated with sediments. Certain forms specialize in scavenging organic material descending from surface ecosystems. Others graze microbial films on rocks or submerged structures. Coloration varies widely. Shallow water amphipods often show pigmentation that provides camouflage. Deeper species tend toward paler or translucent appearances, reflecting limited need for visual concealment in darkness. Sensory structures frequently become more prominent instead. Antennae length increases in some species, improving detection of chemical signals and water movement. The term giant amphipod sometimes appears in popular descriptions. Scientifically, the word giant remains relative. Even the largest Baikal amphipods remain small compared with vertebrates. Nevertheless, their size compared with typical freshwater amphipods elsewhere highlights the unusual ecological stability of the lake. That stability has allowed evolutionary experimentation without the frequent environmental resets common in younger lakes. Sediment analysis supports the idea that amphipod lineages persisted through multiple climatic shifts, including glacial cycles. Ice ages altered surface conditions dramatically across Siberia. Yet Baikal's depth prevented complete freezing. Liquid water remained beneath ice cover. That continuity allowed aquatic organisms to survive when many terrestrial ecosystems underwent major change. Fish species sometimes described informally as Ice Age survivors illustrate similar persistence. The Golomyanka fish, already noted for its translucent body and lipid-rich tissues, occupies deep cold zones where temperature variation remains minimal. Fossil and genetic evidence suggest long-term lineage stability, though evolution certainly continued during that time. Golomyanka reproductive strategy also reflects environmental constraints. Giving birth to live young rather than laying eggs may enhance survival in cold, oxygen-rich water where egg incubation could otherwise prove vulnerable. Lipid content assists buoyancy control without reliance on a swim bladder, which would function differently under high pressure. Another group drawing scientific interest includes Baikal sculpins. These bottom-dwelling fish diversified extensively within the lake. Some species inhabit shallow, rocky habitats. Others specialize in deep sediment zones. Skeletal structure often becomes lighter at depth, reducing energy expenditure while maintaining functionality under pressure. Researchers examining sculpin genetics note divergence times consistent with long isolation. That does not imply unchanged ancestry, but it indicates adaptation within the Baikal basin rather than repeated immigration from external freshwater systems. Such patterns reinforce the lake's role as an evolutionary incubator. Invertebrate worms and mollusks also display deep lineage persistence. Certain Baikal snails possess shell morphologies distinct from relatives elsewhere. Some species show evidence of continuous presence across sediment layers representing tens of thousands of years. That continuity suggests resilience to environmental fluctuations. Microbial communities contribute another dimension to the idea of ancient persistence. Hydrothermal vent regions beneath the lake host bacteria, adapted to chemical energy sources rather than sunlight. Genetic sequencing reveals lineages potentially distinct from surface freshwater microbes. Such organisms may resemble ancient microbial ecosystems that existed widely before complex multicellular life dominated. Diatoms, microscopic algae with silica shells, offer particularly valuable historical records. Their fossilized remains accumulate continuously in sediments. Species composition shifts reflect climate conditions, nutrient availability, and water chemistry changes. Some diatom lineages appear to have persisted in Baikal far longer than in other lakes, again due to basin stability. Ice cover itself influences biological continuity. Winter ice insulates deep water from extreme atmospheric temperature fluctuations. It also limits wind-driven mixing. Some species adapted specifically to seasonal light transmission through ice. Photosynthetic organisms can continue limited activity even under frozen surfaces when snow cover remains thin. Seasonal productivity cycles shape food availability. Surface plankton blooms occur during warmer months. Organic matter sinks gradually. Deep organisms depend partly on that downward flux. Slow sedimentation ensures a steady though modest energy supply, rather than abrupt feast or famine cycles. Energy limitation discourages extremely large predators. Ecological models indicate that supporting very large unknown vertebrates would require higher productivity than currently measured. Amphipods and deep fish represent efficient energy users. Their physiology matches available resources closely. Acoustic surveys occasionally detect dense biological aggregations at depth. These sometimes correspond to amphipod swarms or fish schools. Early sonar interpretations occasionally overestimated organism size due to equipment limitations. Modern calibration improves accuracy significantly. Environmental DNA sampling has become increasingly valuable. Water samples contain genetic traces shed by organisms through skin cells, waste, or decomposition. Sequencing those traces helps identify species presence without direct capture. So far, results largely confirm known biodiversity while occasionally hinting at minor undocumented variants rather than entirely new large species. Human perception of prehistoric often reflects unfamiliar appearance rather than actual evolutionary status. Amphipods with elongated limbs or translucent bodies may seem unusual simply because people rarely observe deep, freshwater invertebrates. Scientific classification places them firmly within modern evolutionary frameworks. Climate stability remains crucial. Rapid warming or pollution could disrupt long-established ecological balances. Endemic species often possess narrow tolerance ranges. Conservation efforts therefore focus on maintaining water quality and monitoring temperature trends carefully. fishing activity historically concentrated on commercially valuable species like ommel. Deep amphipods generally escape direct exploitation, though ecosystem shifts affecting their predators could influence their populations indirectly. Monitoring trophic interactions helps anticipate such effects. Tourism sometimes brings increased curiosity about unusual species. Responsible educational programs emphasize ecological roles rather than sensational narratives. Visitors learning about amphipod diversity often express appreciation for complexity rather than disappointment at absence of dramatic creatures. Research collaboration across disciplines continues expanding understanding. Geologists study sediment history. Biologists analyze species adaptation. Chemists examine water composition. Climate scientists interpret long-term trends. Integrated approaches yield more complete ecological pictures. Technological development remains ongoing. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution cameras and environmental sensors explore previously inaccessible zones. Improved pressure-resistant materials allow longer deployment durations. Data transmission advances facilitate real-time monitoring. Public science communication increasingly highlights evolutionary timescales rather than focusing solely on novelty. Understanding that Baikal ecosystems developed gradually over millions of years encourages appreciation of continuity rather than expectation of sudden discovery. Educational institutions near the lake train new generations of researchers familiar with local conditions. Long-term residence enhances observational continuity. Seasonal fieldwork contributes incremental insights that accumulate over decades. As evidence continues accumulating, the idea of life from another era becomes less about hidden giant animals and more about recognizing how environmental stability preserves evolutionary lineages. Amphipods, sculpins, golomyanca, microbial communities, and endemic invertebrates together form a biological record spanning climatic shifts and geological change. And as focus gradually broadens from invertebrates and deep fish toward the lake's most visible, unusual resident, attention begins naturally shifting to the freshwater seal population and the long-standing question of how such marine origin mammals came to inhabit this isolated inland basin, a topic that links geological history, evolutionary biology, and ongoing scientific investigation without introducing any abrupt narrative break. At some point during almost any conversation about Lake Baikal, someone eventually asks about the seals. The question usually arrives with a hint of surprise, because seals are typically associated with oceans, coastlines, and saltwater environments. Seeing them in a landlocked freshwater lake in Siberia feels unexpected at first. Yet the Baikal seal, often called the nurper, has lived there long enough that it is now completely adapted to the lake's conditions. Scientists understand many aspects of its biology quite well, but the question of how its ancestors originally reached Baikal remains one of the more interesting historical puzzles tied to the lake. The Baikal seal is not enormous compared with some marine seal species. Adults typically reach around 1.3 to 1.5 meters in length and weigh between 50 and 130 kilograms, depending on age, sex, and seasonal fat reserves. Their thick blubber layer helps maintain body temperature in near-freezing water. Fur density also plays a role. Winter ice conditions demand effective insulation, and nurper physiology reflects long adaptation to those conditions. Behaviourally, these seals are well suited to Baikal's seasonal cycle. They breed on ice in late winter, creating breathing holes and resting areas in the frozen surface. Pups are born on the ice, and remain there until strong enough to enter the water regularly. This pattern resembles certain Arctic marine seals, suggesting ancestral behavioural continuity despite freshwater adaptation. Diet consists largely of endemic fish, particularly golomyanca and ommel. Both species thrive in Baikal's cold, oxygen-rich waters. Nurper hunting behaviour aligns with vertical fish distribution. Seals dive frequently, sometimes to considerable depths, though most feeding occurs in mid-depth zones where prey density remains highest. physiological adaptation to freshwater represents a key point. Marine mammals generally process salt differently from freshwater species. NERPA kidneys show functional adjustments, allowing efficient regulation of electrolyte balance in low salinity conditions. These changes would have evolved gradually once isolation occurred. The central question remains migration. Lake Baikal has no direct modern connection to any ocean. The Angara River flows out, eventually joining larger river systems, but its current direction would not facilitate marine seal entry today. Geological history, however, differs from present geography. One leading hypothesis proposes that during certain periods in the distant past, river systems connecting Arctic seas to inland basins differed significantly from modern configurations. Glacial cycles altered drainage patterns repeatedly. Ice sheets blocked some routes while opening others. Temporary waterways may have allowed marine organisms to travel inland. Genetic analysis supports the idea of Arctic ancestry. Comparisons between Baikal seals and Arctic ringed seals show similarities suggesting a relatively recent common ancestor in evolutionary terms, perhaps within the last few million years rather than tens of millions. That time frame corresponds broadly with periods of major climatic fluctuation. Another possibility involves a chain of interconnected lakes and rivers existing during wetter climatic phases. Over thousands of years, seals might have migrated gradually inland following suitable habitats. Subsequent geological changes could have isolated populations in Baikal permanently. Once isolation occurred, natural selection would favour traits suited to freshwater living. Salt excretion mechanisms would adjust. Dietary flexibility would increase reliance on endemic fish species. Reproductive timing might shift slightly to match local ice conditions. These adjustments accumulate over generations without any abrupt transformation. Fossil evidence directly documenting early Baikal seals remains limited. Freshwater sediment conditions do not always preserve mammalian remains well. Most evolutionary reconstruction relies on genetic data combined with geological and climatic models. Local folklore historically incorporated seals without necessarily focusing on their origin. For communities living near the lake, NERPA presence represented normal ecological reality rather than mystery. Only later, as scientific classification distinguished marine and freshwater species more clearly, did the migration question attract broader attention. Early Russian naturalists noted the unusual situation, but lacked tools for genetic comparison. Hypotheses at the time ranged widely, including speculative underground waterways. Modern geology largely rules out such ideas, favouring surface hydrological connections altered over time. Tagging studies in recent decades have improved understanding of seal movement within the lake. Individuals display seasonal migration patterns following prey availability and ice conditions. These movements remain entirely within Baikal, reinforcing the idea of long-term isolation from marine environments. Population estimates vary but generally fall between 80,000 and 120,000 individuals. Conservation status currently appears relatively stable compared with some marine seal populations, though monitoring continues due to environmental change concerns. Pollution risk represents one challenge. Industrial activity near tributary rivers could introduce contaminants. Seals, as higher trophic level animals, accumulate certain pollutants through food chains. Monitoring programs test tissue samples periodically to assess exposure levels. Climate change introduces additional uncertainty. Shorter ice seasons could affect breeding success. Altered fish distribution might influence food availability. Researchers model these factors carefully because endemic species often respond strongly to environmental shifts. Public interest in the seal mystery sometimes drifts toward more speculative ideas. Suggestions occasionally appear about undiscovered marine connections or recent migrations. Current evidence does not support those interpretations. Geological and genetic data strongly indicate ancient rather than recent isolation. Comparative cases elsewhere help contextualize the situation. Freshwater seals also exist in certain parts of the Arctic, such as the Saimaa ringed seal in Finland and the Ladoga seal in Russia. Both represent marine ancestors isolated by post-glacial geological changes. Baikal seals fit broadly within that pattern. Adaptation timescales differ among these populations, but the underlying process remains similar. Geographic isolation followed by gradual physiological and behavioural adjustment. Evolutionary continuity rather than sudden transformation explains their present characteristics. Scientific curiosity persists, partly because Baikal's isolation appears more complete and older than some other freshwater seal habitats. Understanding migration timing contributes to broader knowledge of glacial hydrology and climate history. Educational outreach often uses the Baikal seal example to illustrate evolutionary adaptation clearly. Students readily grasp the concept of marine animals adjusting to fresh water when presented with a living case study rather than abstract theory. Tourism centred on seal observation has grown cautiously. Guidelines emphasise minimal disturbance, especially during breeding season. Responsible viewing practices help balance public interest with conservation needs. Technological advances such as satellite tracking and environmental DNA sampling continue refining knowledge. Future research may narrow migration timelines further or clarify intermediate habitats used during initial inland movement. Despite remaining uncertainties, the overall picture aligns consistently. Ancient marine ancestors entered freshwater systems during geological periods when connections existed, became isolated as landscapes changed, and adapted over many generations to the stable but distinctive environment Lake Baikal provides. And as understanding of this unique mammal settles into place, attention naturally shifts toward the broader range of extreme adaptations seen throughout Baikal's ecosystem, because seals represent only one example of how organisms adjust to cold, pressure, darkness, and long-term isolation without any need for dramatic or speculative explanations. When conditions become consistently cold, dark, and pressurized, life does not simply disappear. Instead, it adapts. Lake Baikal offers a particularly clear example of this, because its deep zones combine all three factors at once. Water near the bottom remains close to 4 degrees Celsius year-round. Sunlight never reaches those depths, and pressure rises steadily the farther down you go. None of those conditions are extreme individually in a global sense, but together, over millions of years, they shape organisms in ways that often look unusual, compared with species living in warmer, brighter, shallower water. Cold water affects metabolism first. Chemical reactions generally slow when temperature drops. For living organisms, that means slower growth, slower movement, and often longer lifespans. Many Baikal species reflect this pattern. Amphipods, fish like the golomyanka, various worms, mollusks, and microbial communities all show metabolic rates suited to conserving energy rather than expending it rapidly. Food availability at depth tends to be limited, so efficiency becomes essential. Enzymes inside cells adjust structurally to function at low temperatures. Proteins that would become too rigid in cold water evolve flexibility. Membrane lipids also change composition. Increased unsaturated fatty acids help maintain membrane fluidity despite cold conditions. Without those adjustments, basic cellular processes would slow too much to sustain life. Pressure introduces another layer of constraint. At 1600 meters depth, water pressure exceeds 160 times atmospheric pressure at sea level. This affects protein folding, membrane stability, and gas solubility. Deepwater Baikal organisms possess biochemical mechanisms that stabilize cellular structures under these forces. While not identical to adaptations in deep ocean species, parallels exist. Certain compounds accumulate in cells that help maintain protein function despite compression. Darkness changes sensory priorities. Vision becomes less useful where light never penetrates. Some deep Baikal fish show reduced eye size or altered visual pigment sensitivity. Others rely more heavily on mechanosensory systems that detect water vibration. Chemical sensing also increases importance. Detecting dissolved substances helps locate food or avoid predators without visual cues. Coloration often reflects darkness as well. Many deep organisms appear pale, translucent, or lightly pigmented. Pigmentation requires metabolic investment, and without light, camouflage becomes less relevant. Reduced pigmentation can therefore represent an energy-saving adaptation rather than a sign of primitiveness. Buoyancy regulation becomes important for species occupying mid-depth zones. The gollum yankerfish provides a well-known example. Instead of a swim bladder, it relies on lipid-rich tissues. Lipids are less dense than water, providing buoyancy without gas-filled structures that behave unpredictably under pressure. This adaptation suits deep environments where pressure variation could compress gas bladders significantly. Reproductive strategies also adapt. Some Baikal species produce fewer offspring but invest more energy in each. Others time reproduction to seasonal productivity cycles in surface waters. Ice cover influences these cycles. Light-penetrating clear winter ice allows limited photosynthesis beneath, sustaining plankton communities that later support higher trophic levels. Dormancy appears in some invertebrates. When food becomes scarce, metabolic slowdown allows survival until conditions improve. This is not complete inactivity, but rather reduced physiological activity. Cold stable water facilitates such strategies because temperature fluctuations remain minimal. Hydrothermal vent regions beneath parts of Baikal introduce chemical energy sources. Microorganisms capable of chemosynthesis utilize minerals released from vents. These microbial communities form localized ecosystems distinct from sunlight-driven surface systems. Research continues to determine their full diversity and ecological impact. Oxygen availability distinguishes Baikal from many deep freshwater lakes. Because cold water holds oxygen efficiently, and mixing occasionally occurs, deep zones remain oxygenated. Organisms there still adapt to lower oxygen flux compared with surface layers, but complete anoxia rarely develops. This allows more complex life than would otherwise be possible. Acoustic communication and detection sometimes supplement other senses. Some fish produce or detect low-frequency sounds. Sound travels efficiently through water, especially in cold conditions. While not extensively documented in Baikal compared with marine systems, evidence suggests acoustic cues play roles in certain species' interactions. Energy transfer through the food web remains conservative. Organic material sinking from surface productivity provides baseline nutrition. Scavengers recycle detritus efficiently. Predators remain relatively small compared with marine analogues because energy availability constrains size. Morphological adaptations often appear subtle rather than dramatic. Slight skeletal lightening reduces energy cost of movement. Fin shapes adjust for slow maneuvering rather than rapid bursts. Exoskeleton thickness in crustaceans balances protection with energy efficiency. Isolation over millions of years reinforces specialization. Without frequent immigration of competing species, endemic organisms refine adaptation to local conditions. This can increase vulnerability to rapid environmental change but enhances efficiency under stable conditions. Microbial adaptation deserves particular emphasis. Bacteria and archaea occupy niches from surface waters to deep sediments. Some metabolize methane released from sediments. Others participate in nitrogen cycling. Molecular techniques continue revealing previously unknown lineages adapted to cold, pressure, and chemical gradients. Diatoms and other plankton species demonstrate seasonal adaptation. Spring blooms occur as ice melts and light increases. Some species remain active under thin ice. Their silica shells, preserved in sediments, provide long-term environmental records. Sponges endemic to Baikal exhibit symbiosis with photosynthetic algae. In shallower zones where light penetrates, these relationships enhance energy acquisition. At greater depths, sponges rely more on filtering organic particles. Structural variation among species reflects depth-related light availability. Fish distribution patterns illustrate vertical adaptation clearly. Some species remain near surface layers year-round. Others migrate seasonally. Deep specialists rarely approach upper zones. Pressure tolerance differences partly explain this separation. Human technology increasingly allows observation of these adaptations directly. Remotely operated vehicles capture video footage of deep habitats. High-resolution sensors measure temperature, oxygen, and chemical gradients continuously. Data accumulation supports refined ecological modelling. Environmental DNA sampling complements visual observation. Genetic traces in water reveal species presence even when organisms remain unseen. This method has confirmed broad biodiversity, while occasionally suggesting minor undocumented variants requiring further investigation. Climate change introduces new selective pressures. Slight warming could alter metabolic rates, oxygen solubility, and plankton productivity. Endemic species adapted to narrow temperature ranges may respond strongly. Long-term monitoring programs track these trends carefully. Pollution sensitivity varies among species. Lipid-rich fish like Golomyanka may accumulate contaminants more readily. Monitoring tissue samples helps assess ecosystem health. Conservation measures aim to maintain Baikal's historically high water quality. Educational outreach emphasizes adaptation rather than sensational mystery. Understanding how life adjusts to cold, pressure, and darkness encourages appreciation of biological resilience. Students often find these examples more compelling than hypothetical unknown creatures. Comparative studies with other ancient lakes such as Tanganyika or Malawi highlight convergent adaptation patterns despite different geographic locations. Stability, isolation, and depth repeatedly produce specialized ecosystems. Interdisciplinary research remains essential. Biologists study organisms directly. Chemists analyze water composition. Geologists examine sediment history. Climate scientists interpret long-term environmental change. Together they form a comprehensive understanding of adaptation processes. Public fascination with extreme environments persists because such settings challenge everyday expectations. Deep lakes, polar oceans, caves, and high-altitude regions all attract curiosity. Baikal provides an accessible, yet scientifically rich example, and with the biological adaptations to cold, pressure, and darkness now clearer, attention begins drifting naturally toward reports of unusual sounds and acoustic phenomena recorded beneath the lake's surface, because sensory adaptation in such environments often intersects with how humans interpret unfamiliar underwater noises without immediately assuming biological origin. When people think about deep water, they usually picture darkness first. Silence often follows in imagination, as if depth automatically removes sound along with light. In reality, water transmits sound extremely well, often better than air. Lake Baikal, because of its depth, temperature stability, seasonal ice cover, and geological activity, produces a surprisingly complex acoustic environment. Researchers have recorded many unusual noises there over the years, some immediately explainable, others requiring careful analysis before conclusions become clear. Sound travels faster in water than in air, roughly 4 times faster depending on temperature, salinity, and pressure. Freshwater behaves slightly differently from seawater because salt content affects density, but the overall principle remains the same. Low-frequency sounds in particular can travel long distances with little energy loss. This means that an event occurring many kilometers away can still be detectable by sensitive instruments placed deep in the lake. Seasonal ice cover plays an important role. During winter, thick ice forms across much of Baikal's surface. Ice acts as both barrier and amplifier. It reflects sound waves downward, creating conditions where acoustic energy remains trapped within the water column. At the same time, the ice itself produces sounds. Cracks propagate as temperature fluctuates. Pressure ridges shift slowly. Gas trapped beneath the ice escapes occasionally. These events can generate noises ranging from sharp cracks to long resonant hums. Early inhabitants living near the lake likely heard such sounds regularly. Without modern acoustic science, interpretation relied on experience and cultural understanding. Some sounds were probably associated with weather changes or seasonal transitions. Others might have seemed more mysterious simply because their source was not visible. Modern hydrophones, underwater microphones designed specifically for aquatic environments, allow continuous recording. Researchers deploy them at various depths to monitor geological activity, biological behaviour, and environmental changes. Long-term recordings reveal patterns rather than isolated events. Patterns often clarify what initially appears unexplained. One common acoustic source involves tectonic microactivity. Lake Baikal sits within an active rift zone where Earth's crust continues slowly separating. Minor seismic events occur regularly. Most are too small to feel at the surface but produce detectable underwater vibrations. Hydrophones record these as low-frequency rumbling or clicking sounds, depending on event characteristics. Gas release represents another frequent source. Methane accumulates within sediments over time. Changes in pressure or temperature sometimes cause bubbles to escape. Rising gas can create distinct acoustic signatures, particularly when bubbles interact with ice above. Sonar readings occasionally detect such plumes, and acoustic sensors confirm their presence. Biological activity contributes as well. Fish movements, feeding behaviour, and schooling patterns generate noise. While freshwater fish generally produce less acoustic output than some marine species, collective movement of large schools can still register. Crustaceans scraping surfaces, sponges filtering water, and microbial gas production all add subtle acoustic elements. Boat traffic introduces modern anthropogenic noise. Research vessels, fishing boats, and tourist craft generate engine sounds that propagate through water efficiently. Monitoring programs distinguish between natural and human-generated acoustic signatures using frequency analysis. Occasionally, researchers encounter sounds not immediately categorized. These cases usually prompt further investigation rather than immediate speculation. Instrument calibration checks come first. Equipment malfunctions can mimic unusual signals. Environmental conditions such as temperature gradients sometimes distort sound propagation unexpectedly. Ice dynamics deserve additional attention. Expansion and contraction of ice sheets produce noises sometimes described as groaning or booming. Temperature swings between day and night amplify these effects. Ice thickness variations create complex acoustic reflections. Acoustic research also assists ecological study. Certain fish species respond to specific sound frequencies. Monitoring those responses helps estimate population distribution. Some invertebrates produce faint clicking sounds during feeding. Identifying such patterns contributes to biodiversity assessment. Hydrothermal vent areas produce distinct acoustic signals as well. Mineral-rich fluids escaping from sediments create turbulence. Temperature differences generate convection currents. Combined, these factors produce low-frequency background noise detectable by sensitive equipment. Wind influences surface conditions, which in turn affect underwater acoustics. Waves transmit energy downward. Strong storms generate broadband noise that can mask quieter biological or geological signals temporarily. Data analysis often accounts for weather conditions recorded simultaneously. Long-term acoustic datasets become valuable environmental indicators. Changes in background noise levels sometimes correlate with climate trends. Shorter ice seasons, for example, alter acoustic reflection patterns. Increased human activity introduces additional noise sources requiring management consideration. Public fascination occasionally focuses on isolated, unexplained recordings. Media reports sometimes emphasize mystery before scientific interpretation completes. Researchers generally prefer cautious analysis because premature conclusions can mislead public understanding. Comparisons with other large lakes help contextualize Baikal's acoustic environment. Similar deep freshwater systems also exhibit complex soundscapes. Differences arise from local geology, climate, and biological composition. Baikal's combination of depth, tectonic activity, and seasonal ice makes its acoustic profile distinctive. Educational outreach programs sometimes include listening sessions, where recorded underwater sounds are presented alongside explanations. Hearing ice cracking or gas bubbling helps people appreciate how natural processes can produce noises that initially seem unusual. Technological advances continue improving acoustic resolution. Digital hydrophones capture wider frequency ranges. Real-time data transmission allows quicker interpretation. Machine learning algorithms assist in pattern recognition across large data sets. Military and navigation interests historically contributed to acoustic research funding globally, though civilian scientific applications now dominate Baikal studies. Understanding underwater sound propagation benefits ecological monitoring and environmental protection. Conservation considerations include noise pollution. Increased boat traffic could affect sensitive species relying on acoustic cues. Guidelines for responsible vessel operation near critical habitats aim to minimize disturbance. Acoustic triangulation techniques sometimes help locate specific sound sources precisely. Multiple hydrophones record the same event. Differences in arrival time allow calculation of origin location. This method proves useful for seismic monitoring and biological studies alike. Winter research expeditions often rely heavily on acoustic equipment because ice cover restricts visual observation. Drilling access holes allows sensor deployment without extensive boat activity. Data collected during winter complements summer surveys. Interdisciplinary collaboration enhances interpretation. Geologists, biologists, physicists, and engineers all contribute expertise. Complex acoustic phenomena rarely belong to a single field exclusively. As understanding improves, most previously mysterious sounds receive conventional explanations rooted in geology, physics, or biology. That does not eliminate curiosity. Instead, it shifts focus toward detailed environmental processes rather than speculative unknown creatures. And with acoustic phenomena considered more carefully, attention begins moving toward documented eyewitness accounts from fishermen, divers, and researchers themselves, because personal observation often interacts with environmental sound and visibility conditions in ways that shape how unusual underwater experiences get reported and interpreted over time. When people spend long periods near deep water, unusual observations almost inevitably occur. Fishermen watching the surface for hours, divers descending below familiar light levels, researchers working with instruments in remote conditions all occasionally encounter situations that do not immediately fit expectations. Around Lake Baikal, such accounts have accumulated over many decades. Most eventually receive straightforward explanations, yet the process of interpreting them illustrates how perception, environment, and incomplete information interact. Fishermen historically form the largest group reporting unexpected experiences. Many work early mornings or late evenings when light angles shift rapidly. Under certain conditions, reflections on the water surface create distorted silhouettes. Waves refract light irregularly. Fish schools moving just below the surface can produce broad, shifting shapes. From a distance, those patterns sometimes resemble larger animals than actually present. Ice fishing introduces additional visual complexity. Clear winter ice often allows partial visibility into the water below, but optical refraction through layered ice and water distorts size and distance. Air bubbles trapped within ice scatter light unpredictably. Cracks propagate across large areas, sometimes accompanied by movement of underlying water. Observers unfamiliar with these optical effects might interpret them as animate motion. Some fishermen have described hearing low-frequency sounds beneath ice while alone on the frozen surface. Modern acoustic research attributes many such sounds to thermal expansion and contraction of ice sheets, gas release from sediments, or distant seismic micro-events. Without technical background, however, those noises can feel unfamiliar enough to invite imaginative interpretation. Divers offer a different perspective. Scientific and recreational diving in Baikal occurs mostly in shallower zones compared with the deepest basins, yet even moderate depths present cold, dark conditions. Visibility varies with season and location. Suspended particles, plankton blooms, and sediment disturbance can reduce clarity quickly. Underwater perception differs significantly from air. Objects appear larger and closer due to optical properties of water. Some divers have reported fleeting glimpses of large shapes moving beyond visibility range. Later analysis often connects these observations to fish schools, drifting vegetation, or sediment clouds. Human vision naturally tries to impose familiar forms on ambiguous stimuli. That cognitive tendency helps rapid recognition in daily life, but sometimes produces misinterpretation under unusual conditions. Scientific divers working on sponge colonies, amphipod habitats, or geological surveys occasionally encounter unexpected acoustic or visual events as well. Researchers typically document such occurrences carefully. Instrument readings, environmental conditions, and photographic evidence are reviewed before drawing conclusions. Most cases resolve into known physical or biological processes. Research vessels sometimes report sonar anomalies. Early sonar equipment lacked the resolution available today. Dense fish aggregations, gas plumes, or uneven sediment layers occasionally produced echoes, interpreted initially as larger objects. Improved calibration and higher frequency systems now reduce such ambiguity significantly. Night observations add another layer. Reduced light above the surface complicates distance estimation. Wind patterns change after sunset. Temperature gradients alter acoustic propagation. Fishermen or researchers operating at night sometimes note movements or sounds that feel unusual until daylight clarifies the source. Weather plays a major role. Sudden storms on Baikal can arise quickly. Wave patterns interacting with shoreline topography generate complex surface motion. Boats may experience unexpected rocking even without visible large waves. Such events sometimes become part of anecdotal reports later retold, with emphasis on uncertainty rather than meteorological detail. Psychological factors also influence interpretation. Expectation shapes perception. If someone already believes a lake may hold unknown creatures, ambiguous observations may be interpreted accordingly. Conversely, a scientist trained to expect physical explanations may interpret the same event differently. Neither approach implies dishonesty, it reflects cognitive framing. Memory reconstruction over time can amplify unusual aspects of an experience. Details fade while distinctive elements remain. Retelling emphasizes what felt surprising. This normal human process can transform a brief ambiguous sighting into a more dramatic narrative years later. Local cultural context contributes as well. Communities with long-standing folklore about hidden lake presences may incorporate new observations into existing narrative frameworks. That continuity preserves cultural identity even as scientific understanding evolves. Modern technology changes reporting patterns. Smartphones allow rapid photography and video capture. Social media enables immediate sharing. Verification sometimes lags behind dissemination. Scientists increasingly engage publicly to explain likely causes of ambiguous images or recordings. Environmental monitoring occasionally benefits from eyewitness reports. Fishermen noticing unusual fish behavior may alert researchers to ecological changes. Divers reporting sediment disturbances can help identify underwater landslides. Personal observation remains valuable when integrated with systematic investigation. Historical records include some intriguing but inconclusive accounts. 19th century expedition journals mention large moving shadows beneath ice. Early 20th century fishermen described unexpected turbulence far from shore. Without instrumentation, those observations remain anecdotal but still form part of the historical context. Comparisons with other large lakes show similar patterns. Lake Tanganyika, the Great Lakes of North America, and Scandinavian lakes all have collections of unusual eyewitness accounts. most eventually align with known environmental phenomena rather than undiscovered large animals. Acoustic perception underwater deserves particular attention. Sound direction becomes harder to judge. Vibrations travel through equipment, water, and sometimes directly through divers' bodies. Distinguishing source location requires experience. Beginners often report sounds as closer or larger than they are. Lighting equipment used in diving can attract organisms unexpectedly. Fish drawn to illumination may appear suddenly within limited visibility range. Rapid movement back into darkness can create the impression of larger unseen bodies beyond the light. Research protocols emphasize documentation rather than immediate interpretation. Video recording, environmental parameter logging, and multiple observer confirmation improve reliability. Scientific culture values cautious explanation over dramatic speculation. Educational outreach encourages critical observation skills. Understanding optical refraction, acoustic propagation, and ecological behavior reduces misinterpretation. Many fishermen and divers now collaborate actively with researchers, sharing observations in structured ways. Climate change may influence future eyewitness reports indirectly. Altered fish distribution, changing ice conditions, and new weather patterns could produce unfamiliar observations. Continuous monitoring helps differentiate environmental change from misperception. Tourism growth also increases the number of observers. More people on the water naturally produce more anecdotal reports. Responsible tourism programs often include basic environmental education to help visitors interpret what they see accurately. Despite modern knowledge, the experience of encountering something unexpected in a vast deep lake retains psychological impact. Uncertainty itself can be memorable. That human response explains why eyewitness accounts persist even when scientific explanations exist. Interdisciplinary study combining psychology, environmental science, and cultural anthropology helps contextualize such reports. Understanding how people perceive and remember unusual events contributes to effective science communication. As more systematic exploration tools become available, reliance on anecdotal observation decreases somewhat. Still, personal accounts often guide researchers toward areas deserving closer investigation, and with eyewitness experiences considered alongside environmental factors that shape perception, attention begins moving toward modern exploration technologies such as submersibles, sonar mapping, and autonomous underwater vehicles, because those tools provide more objective data about deep lake conditions than human observation alone can offer.
When research on Lake Baikal began centuries ago, scientists depended largely on what they could see directly from boats, along shorelines, or through relatively simple sampling equipment. Depth measurements relied on weighted ropes. Biological studies depended on nets and dredges. Those methods provided valuable information, but they also imposed clear limits. The deeper the lake, the more incomplete the picture remained. Modern exploration technology changed that situation gradually rather than suddenly. Submersibles, sonar mapping, remote sensors, and autonomous underwater vehicles now allow researchers to study environments once considered unreachable. Yet even with advanced tools, the scale and complexity of Baikal ensure that exploration remains an ongoing process rather than a completed one. Sonar became one of the earliest transformative technologies for studying deep lakes. The basic principle is straightforward. Sound pulses travel through water, reflect off objects or the lake floor, and return to a receiver. Measuring travel time reveals distance. Early sonar systems in the mid-20th century lacked precision compared with modern equipment, but they immediately demonstrated that Baikal's bottom topography was far more complex than previously assumed. Instead of a simple basin, researchers identified multiple deep subbasins, underwater ridges, steep slopes, and sediment layers of varying thickness. As sonar improved, mapping resolution increased dramatically.
Multi-beam sonar systems now send out many sound pulses simultaneously, producing detailed three-dimensional maps of the lake floor. These maps help geologists understand tectonic rifting processes, identify hydrothermal vent regions, and locate areas where sediment accumulation records past climate change. Biologists also benefit because bottom structure influences habitat distribution. Fish, invertebrates, and microbial communities often cluster around specific geological features. Acoustic surveys do more than map terrain. They also detect biological activity. Schools of fish reflect sound differently than sediments or rocks. Gas plumes rising from the lake floor produce distinctive acoustic signatures. Researchers analyze frequency patterns carefully to distinguish among possible sources. Early misinterpretation sometimes occurred, particularly with older equipment, but calibration standards now minimize such errors. Submersibles brought a different type of insight. Instead of relying solely on remote sensing, scientists could observe deep environments directly. Manned submersibles designed for freshwater research began operating in Baikal during the late 20th century. These vessels require pressure-resistant hulls, life support systems, navigation controls, and specialized lighting. Descending slowly through cold, dark water, operators can film organisms, geological formations, and sediment structures in situ. Direct observation confirmed many earlier hypotheses. Amphipod communities previously inferred from dredge samples appeared on camera. Hydrothermal vent activity became visually documented rather than purely theoretical. Sediment layering showed patterns consistent with long-term geological models. Seeing these environments directly often clarified subtle ecological relationships difficult to infer from samples alone. However, submersibles also have limitations. Field of view remains restricted. Artificial lighting alters animal behavior. Some species avoid illumination entirely, while others approach it curiously. Observations therefore require careful interpretation. A camera capturing an empty area does not necessarily indicate absence of life. Organisms may simply remain outside the light cone. Remotely operated vehicles, commonly called ROVs, expanded exploration capacity further. Unlike manned submersibles, ROVs connect to surface vessels via cables transmitting power and data. Operators control them remotely, reducing risk to human occupants. ROVs can remain underwater longer than manned vehicles because life support constraints disappear. They carry high-definition cameras, sampling arms, chemical sensors, and sonar units. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, represent another step forward. These systems operate without tethers, following programmed routes. They map large areas efficiently, collecting continuous environmental data. Navigation relies on inertial systems, acoustic beacons, and increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms. AUV deployments in Baikal have produced detailed bathymetric maps and environmental datasets previously impossible to obtain. Environmental DNA sampling integrates with these technologies. Water samples collected by ROVs or AUVs undergo genetic analysis. Organisms shed DNA continuously through skin cells, waste, and decomposition. Sequencing these traces reveals species presence even when individuals remain unseen. This method complements visual surveys and traditional net sampling. Long-term sensor arrays now monitor temperature, oxygen levels, chemical composition, and acoustic activity continuously at various depths. These data streams help researchers detect environmental trends such as climate-driven temperature shifts or pollution impacts. Continuous monitoring proves particularly valuable in a lake as large and deep as Baikal, where localized measurements might otherwise miss broader patterns. Winter exploration presents unique opportunities. Thick ice provides a stable platform for drilling access holes. Equipment deployment becomes more controlled than from moving boats. Researchers install sensors beneath ice cover, studying seasonal processes like oxygen exchange, plankton dynamics, and acoustic propagation under frozen conditions. Satellite remote sensing complements underwater exploration. While satellites cannot see deep underwater directly, they provide surface temperature data, ice cover extent, algal bloom indicators, and shoreline changes. Integrating satellite observations with underwater measurements produces a comprehensive environmental picture. Hydrothermal vent studies illustrate the value of combined technologies. Sonar mapping identifies vent locations. Submersibles confirm visual presence. Chemical sensors measure mineral output. Microbial sampling reveals biological communities. Without integrated tools, understanding such systems would remain incomplete. Technological advancement also supports conservation efforts. Monitoring pollution sources, tracking fish population changes, and assessing habitat health require accurate data. Submersibles and sensors help identify problem areas early, allowing management responses before ecological damage becomes severe. Public outreach sometimes includes video footage from submersible missions. Seeing deep Baikal environments directly often changes public perception. Instead of imagining unknown monsters, viewers observe specialized invertebrates, fish adapted to darkness, and geological formations shaped over millions of years. Challenges remain significant. Equipment must withstand cold temperatures and high pressure. Logistics in remote Siberian conditions require careful planning. Funding constraints limit expedition frequency. Data analysis from large sensor networks demands computational resources and interdisciplinary expertise. International collaboration continues playing an important role. Scientists from multiple countries contribute equipment, analytical methods, and comparative expertise from other deep lakes or marine systems. Such cooperation accelerates discovery while promoting shared conservation responsibility. Historical comparison underscores progress. Where early explorers relied on lead lines and visual observation, modern researchers combine sonar imaging, robotic vehicles, genetic sequencing, and real-time environmental monitoring. Each technological layer builds on earlier knowledge rather than replacing it entirely. Despite these advances, complete exploration remains unrealistic. The lake's volume, depth variability, and environmental complexity ensure that some habitats remain only partially studied. Scientific culture accepts this ongoing uncertainty as normal rather than problematic. Public fascination sometimes persists, even as knowledge increases. Curiosity about hidden creatures rarely disappears entirely. Yet modern exploration tends to shift that curiosity toward ecological complexity instead of dramatic speculation. As these exploration technologies continue refining understanding, attention naturally begins moving toward biological feasibility questions, specifically whether large prehistoric vertebrates could realistically survive in Baikal's environment, given energy availability, habitat structure, and ecological constraints, because technological observation now provides enough data to evaluate such possibilities systematically, rather than purely hypothetically. Once people learn how deep, old, and isolated Lake Baikal is, the question often appears almost automatically. Could something large and ancient still be living down there unnoticed? It is a reasonable question at first glance. History includes examples where animals once thought extinct were later found alive, such as the coelacanth fish in deep marine waters. However, answering the question about large prehistoric survivors in Baikal requires looking carefully at biology, ecology, energy balance, and environmental conditions rather than relying on imagination alone. When scientists evaluate plausibility, they focus less on what sounds dramatic and more on what the ecosystem can realistically support. The first factor is energy availability. Every ecosystem depends on energy input. In most aquatic environments, sunlight drives primary production through photosynthesis by algae and plankton near the surface. These organisms form the base of the food web. Fish, invertebrates, and other animals consume them directly or indirectly. Some organic material sinks deeper, feeding bottom communities, but energy transfer between trophic levels is inefficient. Typically, only about 10% of energy passes from one level to the next. This principle limits how large top predators can become in a given environment. Lake Baikal, despite its size, is not highly productive compared with tropical lakes or coastal oceans. Cold temperatures slow biological activity. Nutrient input remains moderate rather than abundant. Water clarity, while aesthetically impressive, partly reflects relatively low suspended organic matter. That means less energy available to support large numbers of large predators. Large prehistoric vertebrates, such as marine reptiles often imagined in popular culture, required substantial caloric intake. They lived in productive ocean environments where food supply supported their size. Transferring that expectation to a cold freshwater lake with moderate productivity quickly raises ecological constraints. Simply put, there is not enough energy flow to sustain unknown giant vertebrates over long periods without clear evidence appearing in fish population decline, carcass discovery, or other ecological signals. Oxygen availability provides another constraint. Baikal's deep waters remain oxygenated compared with many lakes, which supports diverse life. However, oxygen concentration still decreases slightly with depth compared with surface levels. Large active vertebrates typically require high oxygen availability to sustain metabolism. Species adapted to low oxygen environments tend to be smaller or less energetically active. Temperature stability also matters. Cold water slows metabolism but also limits growth rates. Large ectothermic animals, such as reptiles, depend heavily on external heat sources. Deep Baikal waters remain cold year-round, offering little opportunity for thermoregulation. Endothermic mammals, like the Baikal seal, manage cold through insulation and metabolic heat, but such adaptations evolved gradually and require specific physiological mechanisms. Habitat structure influences feasibility as well. Baikal's deep zones consist largely of sediment plains, slopes, and some hydrothermal vent areas. Complex reef-like habitats common in productive marine environments do not exist. Structural complexity often supports biodiversity and provides hunting opportunities for large predators. Its relative absence reduces ecological niches suitable for giant animals. Reproductive biology introduces further limitations. Large vertebrates generally have longer gestation periods, fewer offspring, and slower population growth. Maintaining viable populations requires sufficient individuals to ensure genetic diversity. In a closed freshwater basin like Baikal, without immigration from outside populations, sustaining such numbers without detection becomes increasingly unlikely. Fossil evidence provides indirect insight. Sediment cores from Baikal contain abundant microfossils and environmental records. Remains of large vertebrates would likely appear in these layers if such species had existed there for extended periods. To date, no credible fossil evidence suggests large prehistoric reptiles or unknown giant fish inhabited the lake during its known geological history. Comparative ecosystems help contextualize this assessment. Other ancient deep lakes, such as Tanganyika or Malawi, also host endemic species with long evolutionary histories. Despite extensive study, none have produced evidence of large undiscovered prehistoric vertebrates. Biodiversity tends towards specialized smaller organisms rather than dramatic giants. Human observation patterns add another perspective. Baikal has supported fishing, scientific research, and settlement for centuries. While not every part of the lake receives constant monitoring, persistent large animals would likely produce recurring sightings, carcasses, or consistent sonar detections. The absence of such evidence over long periods weighs heavily in scientific evaluation. Technological advances further reduce uncertainty. Modern sonar mapping, environmental DNA sampling, submersible exploration, and long-term ecological monitoring provide multiple independent detection methods. None have indicated unknown large vertebrate populations. Instead, findings consistently reinforce existing biodiversity knowledge. Environmental DNA studies deserve particular attention. Because organisms shed genetic material continuously, water sampling often reveals species presence even when individuals remain unseen. Extensive Baikal DNA analyses have identified known fish, invertebrates, and microbial species without indicating unknown large vertebrate signatures. Hydrothermal vent ecosystems occasionally spark speculation because they represent less explored zones, yet vent communities generally support specialized microorganisms and small invertebrates, rather than large predators. Energy availability from chemical sources remains limited compared with sunlight-driven systems. Psychological factors contribute to continued interest in prehistoric survival. Humans tend to associate depth and age with mystery. Cultural narratives often amplify that connection. Scientific caution sometimes appears less satisfying emotionally than imaginative possibilities, even when evidence strongly favours conventional explanations. Education efforts increasingly emphasize ecological reasoning. Understanding energy flow, habitat structure, and evolutionary adaptation helps people evaluate such questions critically. Rather than dismissing curiosity, scientists aim to channel it toward learning about real biological processes. Climate change introduces new variables worth considering. Altered temperature patterns, nutrient distribution shifts, and ice cover changes could influence future ecosystem dynamics. However, such changes are more likely to affect existing endemic species than create conditions favourable for large unknown vertebrates suddenly emerging. Conservation implications follow logically. Protecting Baikal's known biodiversity remains more urgent than searching for hypothetical giants. Endemic species with narrow tolerance ranges face greater risk from pollution, overfishing, or climate shifts. Maintaining ecological stability benefits both scientific research and environmental health. Public communication plays a role in balancing wonder with accuracy. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and educational programs often address prehistoric survival questions directly, explaining ecological constraints clearly while still highlighting the lake's genuine uniqueness. Historical examples like the coelacanth remind scientists to remain open-minded, yet context matters. Coelacanths lived in deep marine environments with suitable ecological conditions. Their rediscovery does not imply every isolated ecosystem hides comparable surprises. Long-term monitoring continues nonetheless. Science rarely declares absolute certainty. Instead, it evaluates probability based on available evidence. Current evidence strongly suggests Baikal's deep waters support specialized endemic communities rather than unknown prehistoric giants. As this ecological perspective settles into place, attention naturally shifts toward understanding how the lake's existing deep water ecosystems function collectively, including food chains, nutrient cycling, and species interactions, because appreciating that complexity helps explain why stability persists without requiring dramatic unknown organisms to maintain ecological balance. When attention turns from speculation about large unknown creatures toward the organisms that actually live in Lake Baikal's depths, the picture becomes quieter but far more complex scientifically. Deep water ecosystems rarely depend on dramatic predators or large visible animals. Instead, they function through layered interactions among microorganisms, small invertebrates, fish, and chemical processes unfolding slowly but continuously. In Baikal, isolation, cold temperature, oxygen availability, and geological stability together shape a food web that looks different from most freshwater lakes, while still following fundamental ecological principles. At the very base of the food chain sits primary production, though in deep water this begins mostly near the surface. Sunlight drives photosynthesis in algae, phytoplankton, and certain bacterial communities in upper layers. Baikal's clarity allows light penetration deeper than in many lakes, but even so, most photosynthetic activity occurs within the top few dozen meters. Seasonal cycles influence productivity strongly. Spring ice melt increases light exposure, often triggering plankton blooms. Summer warmth sustains moderate productivity. Autumn cooling and winter ice cover shift conditions again. Organic material generated at the surface gradually sinks. Dead plankton, fish waste, plant fragments, and microbial detritus descend through the water column. This slow downward rain of particles forms the primary energy input for deep ecosystems. The process resembles what oceanographers call marine snow, though in fresh water the composition differs somewhat. Despite its modest appearance, this continuous particle flux sustains entire communities at depth. Microorganisms intercept much of this organic matter before it reaches the bottom. Bacteria decompose complex molecules, releasing nutrients back into the water. Some of these nutrients eventually return upward through mixing processes, supporting future surface productivity. This recycling loop helps maintain long-term ecological stability despite relatively low nutrient input. Certain microbial groups derive energy chemically rather than through photosynthesis. In Baikal, hydrothermal vent regions provide localized mineral-rich environments where chemosynthetic bacteria thrive. These microorganisms utilize compounds such as methane or reduced sulfur species released from sediments. While these vent systems are not as extensive as those found in deep oceans, they still contribute niche energy sources supporting specialized life forms. Small invertebrates represent the next major trophic level. Amphipods dominate many deep habitats. Their diversity reflects adaptation to different food sources and environmental conditions. Some species specialize in scavenging sinking organic material. Others graze microbial films on sediment surfaces. A few actively hunt even smaller invertebrates. Their role in recycling nutrients proves essential for maintaining ecosystem balance. Worms, mollusks, and microscopic crustaceans also participate actively in decomposition and nutrient cycling. Many live partly buried in sediments, filtering particles from water or processing detritus directly. This benthic community forms a biological bridge between sinking organic matter and higher trophic levels. Fish inhabiting deeper zones tend to be smaller and less metabolically demanding than shallow water species. The Golomyanka fish stands out as a key intermediate predator. Feeding on amphipods and smaller fish, it converts lower-level biomass into a form accessible to higher predators like the Baikal seal. Its lipid-rich tissues provide efficient energy storage suited to cold conditions. Vertical distribution of fish species often reflects food availability rather than strictly temperature or pressure constraints. Some individuals migrate upward seasonally to exploit plankton blooms. Others remain at consistent depths, where detrital food supply remains stable. These patterns vary across species and environmental conditions. Predation pressure in deep ecosystems generally remains lower than in productive shallow waters. Energy scarcity discourages large predator populations. Instead, food webs emphasize efficiency, recycling, and slow turnover rather than rapid consumption cycles. Sediment processes also play a role. Organic particles accumulating on the lake floor undergo gradual decomposition. Microbial communities within sediments transform nutrients chemically. Some products diffuse back into the water column. Others become buried long-term, contributing to the extensive sediment record that scientists use for climate reconstruction. Oxygen availability distinguishes Baikal from many other deep lakes. Cold temperatures and occasional mixing prevent widespread anoxic conditions. This allows aerobic decomposition processes to dominate rather than anaerobic pathways common in oxygen-depleted systems. Aerobic metabolism generally releases energy more efficiently, supporting diverse biological communities. Hydrological inputs from tributary rivers introduce nutrients and organic matter as well. Seasonal snowmelt contributes pulses of material. River inflows also carry microorganisms and sediments, influencing local ecological conditions near delta regions. Isolation remains a defining feature. Because Baikal has limited biological exchange with other freshwater systems, its food web developed internally over millions of years. Endemic species fill ecological roles that in younger lakes might belong to more widespread organisms. This internal evolution enhances specialization, but can reduce resilience to rapid environmental change. Temperature stability at depth supports consistent metabolic patterns. Organisms experience fewer seasonal fluctuations than surface species. Predictability favours long lifespans, slow growth, and efficient energy utilization. Many Baikal invertebrates and fish reflect these life history strategies clearly. Climate change introduces new uncertainties. Surface warming can alter plankton productivity, ice cover duration, and nutrient cycling. Because deep ecosystems depend partly on surface-derived organic matter, changes above eventually influence conditions below. Long-term monitoring aims to track these shifts carefully. Human activity adds another variable. Pollution, overfishing, and shoreline development potentially affect nutrient input and species distribution. Conservation measures attempt to minimize disruption. Maintaining water quality remains essential for preserving endemic biodiversity. Technological advances continue refining understanding of deep water food webs. Environmental DNA analysis helps identify species presence across trophic levels. Stable isotope studies reveal feeding relationships by tracing nutrient pathways through organisms. Autonomous underwater vehicles collect continuous environmental data supporting ecological modelling. Educational outreach increasingly emphasises the interconnected nature of these systems. Instead of focusing solely on visible animals, programs highlight microbial processes, nutrient cycling, and energy flow. This broader perspective helps explain how deep ecosystems function without dramatic large predators. Comparisons with marine deep-sea ecosystems show both similarities and differences. Both rely partly on sinking organic material. Both feature specialised low-light adaptations. However, freshwater chemistry, lower overall productivity and tectonic setting produce distinct ecological dynamics in Baikal. Long-term ecological stability does not imply stagnation. Evolution continues gradually. Species adapt to subtle environmental changes. Genetic variation accumulates. The food web remains dynamic even if changes unfold slowly compared with human timescales. Scientific interest persists partly because Baikal offers a rare opportunity to study such stability. Few freshwater systems combine comparable age, depth, and isolation. Insights gained there inform broader ecological theory applicable to other environments. Public fascination sometimes shifts once people understand this complexity. The absence of giant unknown creatures becomes less disappointing when replaced by appreciation for intricate biological networks sustaining life quietly over millions of years. And as understanding of deep water food chains settles into place, attention begins moving toward the geological record preserved in Baikal's sediments, because those layers not only document ecological history, but also provide climate archives that help explain how these ecosystems persisted through vast environmental changes. When scientists describe Lake Baikal as a natural archive, they're referring to something very concrete rather than metaphorical. Over millions of years, particles have settled slowly to the lake floor. Dust from distant deserts, volcanic ash carried by winds, pollen from surrounding forests, microscopic algae shells, fragments of organisms, mineral grains from rivers, all descend gradually through the water column. Each year adds a thin layer. Over geological time, those layers accumulate into thick sediment sequences that preserve detailed records of environmental change. Studying them allows researchers to reconstruct climate history far beyond what written human records could ever provide. Sediment accumulation works quietly but persistently. In most lakes, sediment buildup eventually fills the basin. Baikal's tectonic setting prevents that. The rift beneath continues subsiding slowly, creating space for ongoing accumulation. As a result, sediment thickness reaches several kilometers in some parts of the lake. Few freshwater systems on Earth preserve such continuous long-term records. Extracting sediment cores requires specialized drilling platforms. Researchers deploy floating rigs in open water or drill through winter ice when the surface becomes stable enough to support equipment. Core barrels descend carefully to avoid disturbing layering. Once retrieved, cores remain refrigerated to preserve chemical and biological integrity until laboratory analysis begins. Layer identification involves several techniques. Visual inspection sometimes reveals distinct color changes corresponding to seasonal deposition. Darker layers may indicate higher organic content. Lighter layers often reflect mineral influx from rivers or dust storms. Volcanic ash layers appear as fine distinct bands, providing time markers linked to known eruptions. Radiometric dating methods help determine absolute ages. Certain isotopes decay at predictable rates. Measuring their ratios within sediment samples allows age estimation. Magnetic polarity reversals, recorded when minerals align with Earth's magnetic field during deposition, offer additional chronological anchors because global reversal timelines are well established. Pollen analysis provides insights into past vegetation. Plants release pollen grains that settle into the lake. Identifying pollen species in sediment layers reveals which plant communities dominated surrounding landscapes at different times. Changes in vegetation often correlate with climate shifts, such as warming periods favouring forest expansion or cooling phases encouraging grassland dominance. Diatoms, microscopic algae with silica shells, serve as another key indicator. Different species thrive under specific temperature, nutrient, and light conditions. Their fossilized remains accumulate continuously. By examining species composition across layers, scientists infer past water temperature, productivity, and chemical conditions. Isotopic analysis of oxygen and carbon within sediment components yields further climate clues. Oxygen isotope ratios, for example, can reflect temperature and precipitation patterns. Carbon isotopes help reconstruct biological productivity and carbon cycling dynamics. Dust particles preserved in sediments sometimes originate thousands of kilometers away. Identifying their mineral composition reveals wind patterns and aridity levels in distant regions. Such information contributes to broader climate models beyond the immediate Baikal basin. Glacial cycles leave distinct signatures as well. During colder periods, ice cover duration increases, river flow patterns shift, and sediment composition changes. Layers corresponding to major ice ages show variations in organic content, mineral influx, and microfossil distribution consistent with cooler conditions. Interglacial periods display different characteristics: increased biological productivity, altered vegetation pollen, and modified chemical indicators reflect warmer climates. Tracking these transitions across sediment sequences allows scientists to reconstruct long-term climate oscillations with considerable detail. Volcanic ash layers provide particularly useful time markers because major eruptions disperse ash globally. When identified within Baikal sediments, these layers link local records with global geological events. Correlating multiple sediment cores enhances chronological accuracy. Hydrothermal activity beneath the lake sometimes influences sediment chemistry locally. Mineral-rich vent emissions alter surrounding deposits. Identifying these zones helps distinguish between climate-driven changes and geological influences. Human impact appears only in the most recent sediment layers. Industrial pollutants, synthetic compounds, and increased nutrient input from modern activity leave measurable traces. Comparing these recent layers with ancient sediments highlights how rapidly human influence can alter environmental conditions. Long-term continuity makes Baikal sediment records especially valuable. Many lakes experience drying, refilling, or major disturbances interrupting deposition. Baikal's persistent water body ensures relatively uninterrupted accumulation, allowing climate reconstruction spanning millions of years. Climate models benefit significantly from such records. Understanding how temperature, precipitation, and ecosystem dynamics changed historically improves predictions about future climate behavior. Baikal data complement ice core records, ocean sediment studies, and terrestrial geological archives. Interdisciplinary collaboration proves essential. Geologists interpret mineral composition, biologists analyze microfossils, chemists examine isotopic ratios, climate scientists integrate findings into global models. Each discipline contributes a piece of the broader environmental puzzle. Technological advances continue refining analysis. High-resolution scanning reveals microlayering invisible to earlier methods. Advanced spectroscopy identifies chemical compounds precisely. DNA analysis sometimes detects genetic traces from ancient organisms preserved in sediments. Ancient DNA studies have begun revealing past biodiversity patterns. Genetic fragments preserved in sediment layers indicate historical species presence even when physical fossils remain scarce. This method helps track evolutionary changes within Baikal ecosystems over time. Public interest often increases when sediment research connects past climate shifts to present environmental concerns. Demonstrating natural variability alongside recent anthropogenic change encourages informed discussion about sustainability and conservation. Educational programs sometimes display sediment cores visually. Seeing distinct layers representing thousands or millions of years makes abstract geological time more tangible. Such exhibits help bridge scientific understanding and public perception. Conservation implications follow naturally. Recognizing Baikal as a long-term environmental archive underscores the importance of preserving its integrity. Pollution or excessive disturbance could compromise future scientific study as well as ecological health. Comparisons with other ancient lakes reinforce Baikal's uniqueness. While African rift lakes also preserve valuable sediment records, Baikal's colder climate, freshwater chemistry, and tectonic history produce distinct environmental archives. Climate research increasingly relies on combining multiple data sources. Baikal sediment records integrate with polar ice cores, ocean drilling projects, and terrestrial geological studies. Together, these archives form a comprehensive picture of Earth's climate evolution. Even subtle changes recorded in recent decades attract attention. Slight warming trends, altered plankton communities, and shifting ice cover patterns appear in upper sediment layers. Continuous monitoring helps determine whether these trends represent temporary variation or longer-term change. And as the idea of Lake Baikal as a long-term climate archive settles into perspective, attention naturally begins moving toward the possibility of species yet undiscovered within its depths, not necessarily dramatic large animals, but organisms whose existence might still await documentation given the lake's scale, complexity, and ongoing exploration efforts. When scientists talk about undiscovered life in Lake Baikal, they usually mean something very specific. They are not picturing giant hidden animals waiting dramatically in the dark. Instead, they are thinking about smaller organisms, specialized invertebrates, microorganisms, or fish variants that have not yet been fully documented. That expectation comes from experience. In almost every complex ecosystem studied closely, especially one as old and isolated as Baikal, new species descriptions continue appearing even after decades of research. Discovery in biology often proceeds quietly, through careful sampling and classification, rather than sudden sensational revelation. The scale of the lake alone supports this possibility. Baikal contains an enormous volume of water, varied depth zones, multiple geological basins, hydrothermal vent regions, sediment plains, rocky slopes, and seasonal environmental gradients. Each distinct habitat can support specialized life forms. Because exploration resources remain limited, researchers cannot survey every microhabitat continuously. Some organisms therefore remain undocumented simply because sampling has not yet reached them. Microorganisms represent the largest unknown category. Advances in molecular biology revealed that microbial diversity worldwide far exceeds earlier estimates. Traditional microscopy identified only organisms with visible structure. Modern DNA sequencing detects genetic signatures even when organisms are rare, fragile, or difficult to culture in laboratories. Baikal water samples consistently produce genetic sequences not matching previously catalogued species. Many likely belong to bacteria or archaea, adapted specifically to cold freshwater conditions. Deep sediment layers also harbour microbial communities. Some organisms survive in low-energy conditions by metabolizing trace chemical compounds slowly. These communities resemble those found in deep ocean sediments. Because extracting uncontaminated sediment samples remains technically demanding, microbial diversity there likely remains undercounted. Invertebrates provide another area of ongoing discovery. Amphipods, already noted for their diversity, still yield new species descriptions occasionally. Subtle morphological differences combined with genetic analysis reveal lineages previously grouped together incorrectly. Such discoveries refine ecological understanding without dramatically changing overall ecosystem structure. Small worms, mollusks, and insect larvae also appear in new classifications periodically. Many differ only slightly in anatomy from known species. Distinguishing them requires detailed laboratory work rather than dramatic field encounters. Taxonomy, the science of classification, often advances incrementally through such careful comparison. Fish diversity in Baikal is relatively well documented compared with microorganisms or invertebrates, yet minor undiscovered variants remain plausible. Some fish populations occupy narrow depth ranges or localized habitats difficult to sample regularly. Genetic studies sometimes reveal distinct populations within what was previously considered a single species. Environmental DNA sampling accelerates discovery. Collecting water samples and sequencing genetic fragments allows researchers to detect species presence without capturing individuals directly. This method often identifies genetic signatures requiring further investigation. Follow-up expeditions then attempt direct observation or specimen collection. Technological limitations still influence discovery rates. Deep exploration equipment remains expensive. Remote Siberian logistics complicate frequent sampling. Weather conditions restrict access during certain seasons. Each expedition must balance research priorities carefully. Historical precedent supports ongoing discovery expectations. When systematic Baikal research intensified in the 19th and 20th centuries, scientists documented numerous endemic species previously unknown to science. Even today, new diatom species, bacterial strains, and invertebrate variants appear in academic journals. Comparative analysis with other ancient lakes reinforces this trend. Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi, for example, continue yielding new species descriptions decades after intensive study began. Old stable ecosystems often harbour cryptic biodiversity that only advanced methods reveal. Ecological stability contributes to this hidden diversity. Long-term environmental continuity allows gradual specialization. Species may adapt to extremely narrow niches. Such specialization sometimes produces organisms difficult to detect using broad sampling techniques. Hydrothermal vent zones remain particularly intriguing. Chemical gradients there support unique microbial communities. Because vent locations are scattered and sometimes difficult to access, comprehensive biological surveys remain incomplete. Future research may identify additional specialized organisms. Seasonal variation influences detectability as well. Some species appear only during specific temperature or nutrient conditions. Sampling at the wrong time may miss them entirely. Long-term monitoring improves detection probability. Human impact introduces both challenges and urgency. Pollution or climate change could threaten endemic species before full documentation occurs. Conservationists emphasize identifying biodiversity early to inform protective measures. Public perception sometimes expects discovery to involve large visible animals. Scientific reality usually involves microorganisms, small invertebrates, or subtle genetic distinctions.
Communicating this effectively helps align expectations with evidence. Taxonomic work requires patience. Collecting specimens represents only the beginning. Detailed morphological analysis, genetic sequencing, peer review, and publication follow. Years may pass between initial discovery and formal recognition of a new species. Educational outreach highlights this process increasingly. Students learning about biodiversity often find the idea of undiscovered microscopic life as compelling as larger organisms once they understand ecological significance. International collaboration plays a crucial role. Researchers from different countries contribute expertise in genetics, microbiology, limnology, geology, and environmental monitoring. Shared data accelerate discovery while supporting conservation strategies. Funding patterns influence research focus. Large charismatic animals often attract more public attention and funding. Microbial diversity studies sometimes receive less visibility despite scientific importance. Advocacy for balanced funding continues within the scientific community. Climate-driven environmental change may also reveal previously hidden species indirectly. Altered temperature or nutrient conditions can shift species distributions, making rare organisms more detectable temporarily. Technological innovation continues expanding discovery potential.
Improved submersibles, autonomous sampling devices, high-throughput sequencing, and advanced imaging systems allow exploration at finer scales than ever before. Ethical considerations accompany discovery. Introducing invasive sampling methods risks disturbing fragile habitats. Researchers balance scientific curiosity with conservation responsibility carefully. Documentation extends beyond species identification. Understanding ecological roles, reproductive strategies, and environmental tolerances requires long-term study. New species discovery marks the beginning of research rather than its conclusion. Public engagement often benefits from emphasizing continuity rather than mystery. The lake's evolutionary history, geological stability, and ecological complexity provide sufficient fascination without invoking dramatic unknown giants. As scientific exploration progresses, the probability of discovering additional small endemic organisms remains high. The probability of uncovering large prehistoric vertebrates remains low based on current ecological evidence. Maintaining that distinction helps preserve scientific credibility while encouraging ongoing curiosity. And as the possibility of undiscovered species settles into perspective, attention begins naturally shifting toward the psychological side of hidden creature narratives themselves. Because understanding why humans imagine unseen animals in deep environments helps explain the persistence of such ideas even when scientific evidence points elsewhere. When conversations turn toward hidden creatures in deep lakes, oceans, forests, or remote places, the discussion often shifts from biology into psychology without people noticing. The human mind has particular ways of dealing with uncertainty, especially in environments where direct observation becomes difficult. Lake Baikal, with its depth, age, isolation, and cold dark waters, naturally triggers that response. Understanding why people imagine hidden monsters there says as much about human perception and cognition as it does about the lake itself. One fundamental factor involves incomplete information. Humans evolved to make rapid judgments about surroundings, sometimes with limited sensory data. In early environments, hesitation could mean danger. Seeing movement in tall grass or hearing unfamiliar sounds often required immediate interpretation. When sensory input remains ambiguous, the brain tends to fill gaps with possibilities that favour caution. Deep water environments naturally produce ambiguous input, distorted light, unfamiliar acoustics, partial visibility, and delayed sensory feedback. Pattern recognition plays a central role. The human brain excels at identifying shapes quickly. That skill helps with facial recognition, reading expressions, detecting threats, and navigating complex environments. However, strong pattern recognition can also produce false positives. Shadows, waves, floating debris, or fish schools can resemble larger creatures momentarily. Once the brain proposes a familiar pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it immediately. Memory reconstruction adds another layer. Experiences are not stored perfectly. Each recollection slightly reshapes details based on current beliefs, expectations, and social context. If someone recalls an ambiguous underwater movement years later, the memory may gradually emphasize unusual aspects while ordinary explanations fade. This does not imply intentional exaggeration. It reflects normal cognitive processing. Cultural storytelling amplifies these tendencies. Societies worldwide develop narratives about hidden creatures in environments difficult to explore directly. Scottish folklore describes Loch Ness. Scandinavian lakes have their own traditions. North American Great Lakes occasionally generate similar stories. These narratives persist because they provide shared identity, entertainment, and sometimes cautionary lessons about environmental hazards. Lake Baikal's cultural context includes indigenous Buryat traditions, emphasizing respect for natural forces. Some stories reference protective spirits or unseen presences in the water. Such narratives historically served practical purposes. Deep cold water poses real risk. Framing that danger symbolically encouraged careful behavior without requiring scientific explanation. Media influence cannot be ignored. Modern documentaries, films, novels, and online content often highlight mystery themes. Visual storytelling tends to favor dramatic possibilities. Even when creators aim for accuracy, editing choices sometimes emphasize suspense more than probability. Audiences exposed repeatedly to such framing may interpret ambiguous environmental observations through that lens. Cognitive bias also contributes. Confirmation bias leads people to notice information supporting existing beliefs, while overlooking contradictory evidence. Someone already inclined to believe in hidden creatures may interpret normal acoustic or visual phenomena accordingly. Conversely, a trained scientist may lean toward conventional explanations first. Both approaches reflect cognitive filtering rather than deliberate distortion. Emotional factors matter too. Mystery generates engagement. The possibility of something undiscovered stimulates curiosity and imagination. Humans often enjoy uncertainty in controlled contexts, such as storytelling, exploration, or scientific inquiry. Hidden creature narratives provide a safe way to experience that curiosity. Fear responses interact with these processes. Deep water historically represented danger for many human populations. Limited swimming ability, unpredictable currents, and unseen hazards created legitimate risk. Associating depth with hidden threats reinforced caution. That association persists even when modern safety measures reduce actual danger. Environmental aesthetics influence perception as well. Calm, reflective water surfaces, especially under ice or at dusk, can appear visually deceptive. Light refraction distorts shapes. Subtle movements become exaggerated by contrast. Observers may feel that something lies beneath even when no specific object appears. Psychologists sometimes describe this as agency detection. Humans evolved to detect intentional agents quickly, such as predators or rivals. When encountering ambiguous stimuli, the brain sometimes assigns agency prematurely. A moving shadow may feel purposeful even when caused by wind or water currents. Social reinforcement strengthens narratives. Shared stories among fishermen, divers, or local communities build collective interpretation frameworks. New observations get incorporated into existing narratives, maintaining continuity. Social acceptance often depends on storytelling conventions rather than strict empirical verification. Scientific education gradually modifies these patterns. Learning about optics, acoustics, ecology, and cognitive bias helps individuals interpret ambiguous situations more accurately. However, Emotional fascination with mystery rarely disappears entirely, even among scientists. Curiosity motivates research. Historical scientific discoveries occasionally reinforce openness to unexpected findings. Coelacanth fish, giant squid documentation, and deep-sea hydrothermal ecosystems were once poorly understood. These examples remind researchers to avoid absolute dismissal while still emphasizing evidence-based reasoning. Technological mediation also influences perception. Sonar images, underwater video, and acoustic recordings require interpretation. Artifacts or resolution limits can produce ambiguous data. Training improves interpretation accuracy, but initial impressions may still evoke speculation. Educational outreach increasingly addresses psychological aspects directly. Museums, documentaries, and academic programs explain why humans imagine hidden creatures, while also presenting ecological realities. This approach respects curiosity without encouraging misinformation. Climate change may indirectly affect perception. Altered ice patterns, fish distributions, and weather conditions could produce unfamiliar observations. Understanding environmental change reduces the chance of misinterpretation. Tourism adds another dimension. Visitors unfamiliar with local environmental conditions may interpret normal phenomena as unusual. Guided educational programs help contextualize observations effectively. Anthropological research shows that hidden creature narratives often coexist comfortably with scientific understanding. Communities may appreciate folklore culturally while accepting biological explanations intellectually. This dual perspective reflects human capacity for symbolic storytelling alongside empirical reasoning. Neuroscience research suggests that uncertainty activates brain reward pathways linked to curiosity. Mystery itself becomes engaging. Hidden creature narratives provide ongoing uncertainty without requiring resolution. Communication strategies matter. Scientists presenting ecological complexity clearly often reduce reliance on speculative narratives. When people understand how deep water ecosystems function, they may find reality sufficiently fascinating without invoking unknown monsters. Ultimately, imagining hidden creatures reflects normal human cognition, interacting with complex environments. It does not indicate irrationality. Instead, it highlights how perception, memory, culture, and emotion shape interpretation. And as this psychological perspective settles into place, attention begins shifting naturally toward conservation considerations, because protecting Lake Baikal's real biodiversity and environmental stability becomes more urgent once fascination moves from imagined creatures to the very real ecosystems that have persisted there for millions of years. When people become fascinated by Lake Baikal, the conversation often begins with curiosity. It might start with questions about depth, unusual species, ancient geological history, or even the possibility of unknown life. Curiosity itself is not a problem. In fact, scientific research depends on it. But eventually, curiosity meets responsibility. An ecosystem as old, deep, and biologically unique as Baikal cannot remain unchanged if human interest turns into unchecked activity. That balance between exploration and protection has become one of the most important themes surrounding the lake today. Lake Baikal holds roughly 1/5 of the planet's unfrozen freshwater supply. That statistic alone makes conservation important beyond local or regional concerns. Freshwater scarcity already affects many parts of the world. While Baikal's water volume appears vast, its ecological stability depends on maintaining water quality. Pollution, nutrient overload, or invasive species introduction could disrupt delicate biological balances built over millions of years. Industrial development historically presented one of the earliest conservation challenges. During the 20th century, pulp and paper production near the lake generated significant concern. Waste discharge threatened water clarity and endemic species. Public pressure, scientific evidence, and policy changes eventually reduced some of those impacts, but the episode demonstrated how quickly human activity could influence even a large, seemingly resilient lake. Tourism now represents a more diffuse but growing pressure. Visitors drawn by scenery, winter ice formations, wildlife observation, and scientific interest increase economic opportunities for local communities. At the same time, infrastructure development, waste management challenges, and increased transportation activity require careful regulation. Responsible tourism policies aim to balance economic benefit with environmental protection. Fishing pressure also requires monitoring. Species like a mule have long supported local livelihoods. Overfishing risks population decline, which can cascade through the food web. Regulatory measures, including seasonal restrictions and catch limits, attempt to maintain sustainable levels. Enforcement remains essential because illegal fishing can undermine conservation efforts. Climate change introduces broader environmental uncertainty. Surface water temperature trends, ice cover duration, and seasonal precipitation patterns all influence ecological processes. Shorter winters may affect breeding cycles of species like the Baikal seal. Altered plankton productivity could influence entire food chains. Long-term datasets collected by researchers help detect these changes early. Pollution risk today includes not only industrial discharge but also microplastics, agricultural runoff, and atmospheric deposition. Even remote regions receive pollutants transported by air currents. Monitoring programs track chemical concentrations in water, sediments, and biological tissues. Early detection allows intervention before irreversible damage occurs. Invasive species represent another concern. Lake Baikal's endemic organisms evolved in isolation. They often lack defences against newcomers. Introducing non-native species, even unintentionally through shipping, tourism, or scientific equipment transfer, could disrupt existing ecological relationships significantly. Strict biosecurity protocols attempt to prevent such introductions. Scientific exploration itself must consider environmental impact. Submersibles, drilling operations, and sampling expeditions carry potential disturbance risks. Modern research ethics emphasize minimal impact methods whenever possible. Environmental assessments accompany major research projects to ensure preservation of sensitive habitats. Educational outreach plays a central role in conservation success. When local communities, tourists, and the global public understand Baikal's ecological importance, support for protective policies tends to increase. Museums, research institutes, documentaries, and school programs contribute to that awareness. Cultural heritage connects closely with conservation. Indigenous Boyat traditions emphasize respect for the lake as a living entity. Integrating traditional ecological knowledge with modern science often strengthens conservation strategies. Local communities frequently serve as the first observers of environmental change. Economic considerations cannot be ignored. Conservation policies that disregard local livelihoods often fail. Sustainable tourism, regulated fishing, and environmentally responsible infrastructure development provide alternatives that support both ecology and economy. Long-term planning remains essential. International recognition reinforces protection efforts. Lake Baikal holds UNESCO World Heritage status, highlighting its global significance. Such designation encourages international cooperation, funding opportunities, and heightened environmental oversight. Technological monitoring increasingly supports conservation. Satellite imagery tracks shoreline development and ice cover changes. Autonomous sensors measure water chemistry continuously. Environmental DNA sampling detects biodiversity shifts early. These tools provide data necessary for informed policy decisions. Legal frameworks evolve as new challenges emerge. Environmental regulations addressing industrial discharge, fishing quotas, tourism infrastructure, and pollution standards continue adapting. Enforcement effectiveness determines real-world impact more than policy existence alone. Public perception influences policy strongly. When Baikal is seen primarily as a mysterious or exotic destination, conservation messaging may struggle. When it is understood as a critical freshwater reserve and unique evolutionary habitat, support often strengthens. Science communication plays a key role in shaping that perception. Climate resilience strategies now enter planning discussions. Protecting watershed forests, managing runoff, and maintaining water quality help buffer ecological systems against climate variability. Preventive measures often prove more effective than reactive interventions. Research institutions near the lake maintain long-term ecological monitoring programs. Continuous observation provides baseline data, essential for detecting gradual change. Collaboration between Russian and international scientists enhances analytical capacity. Environmental activism sometimes emerges locally when threats appear imminent. Community engagement ensures that conservation concerns remain visible in public discourse. Balanced dialogue between stakeholders helps avoid polarization. Technological innovation in waste treatment, sustainable tourism infrastructure, and low-impact transportation offers additional protective tools. Applying such technologies thoughtfully can reduce human ecological footprint around the lake. Historical perspective reminds observers that even ancient ecosystems remain vulnerable. Age does not guarantee resilience against rapid modern change. Preserving Baikal requires active stewardship rather than passive admiration. Educational programs increasingly emphasize stewardship rather than simple appreciation. Understanding ecological processes encourages responsible behavior among visitors and residents alike. Scientific curiosity continues driving exploration, yet researchers increasingly integrate conservation goals into project design. Studying biodiversity helps protect it. Understanding ecosystem function informs management decisions. As awareness grows, the narrative surrounding Baikal gradually shifts from mystery toward responsibility. The lake remains fascinating scientifically and culturally, but its long-term survival depends on careful management. And with conservation considerations now part of the broader picture, attention naturally begins moving toward the remaining scientific uncertainties themselves, because even with extensive research, certain aspects of Lake Baikal's geology, biology, and long-term environmental dynamics remain only partially understood. Even with centuries of observation, decades of modern research, and increasingly advanced technology, Lake Baikal still contains scientific uncertainties. These are not mysteries in the dramatic sense often portrayed in popular media. They are gaps in data, unanswered ecological questions, incomplete geological reconstructions, and evolving climate interpretations. That situation is normal for any large natural system, especially one as old, deep, and geographically remote as Baikal. Science rarely finishes a subject completely. Instead, understanding improves gradually while new questions appear alongside answers. One of the most significant unknowns involves the full extent of biodiversity at microscopic levels. Microbial communities form the foundation of aquatic ecosystems, yet they remain difficult to catalogue exhaustively. DNA sequencing reveals genetic signatures not matching known species regularly. Determining whether these represent entirely new organisms, genetic variants of known species, or transient populations requires further study. Culturing such microbes in laboratories often proves challenging because they depend on precise environmental conditions. Deep sediment ecosystems also remain only partially understood. Microorganisms living several meters beneath the lake floor metabolize organic material extremely slowly. Their contribution to long-term nutrient cycling, methane production, and chemical transformation still requires more detailed investigation. Drilling sediment cores deep enough for comprehensive sampling presents technical challenges and logistical costs. Geological evolution of the rift basin continues attracting attention. While scientists know Baikal formed through tectonic separation, precise rates of crustal movement, sediment accumulation dynamics, and long-term basin morphology changes remain subjects of ongoing research. Seismic monitoring improves understanding gradually, but interpreting geological processes unfolding over millions of years requires extended datasets. Hydrothermal vent systems beneath the lake present another partially explored area. Compared with oceanic vents, Baikal vents remain less extensively mapped and sampled. Their microbial communities, mineral output variability, and influence on surrounding ecosystems remain active research topics. Improved submersible technology helps, yet coverage remains incomplete. Climate history reconstruction from sediments continues evolving. While long-term patterns are increasingly clear, fine-scale climate fluctuations still require additional data. Understanding how regional Siberian climate interacted with global climate cycles during past ice ages helps refine predictive models for future climate change. Ice cover dynamics also present uncertainties. Researchers track freeze-up and thaw timing carefully, because these influence light penetration, plankton productivity, and oxygen exchange. Climate warming appears to affect ice duration, but predicting long-term ecological consequences requires continued observation. Fish population dynamics involve ongoing study as well. Species like omul show fluctuations influenced by fishing pressure, climate variation, and ecological interactions. Modelling future population stability depends on integrating multiple environmental variables, some of which remain imperfectly understood. The Baikal seal population, although relatively well studied compared with many species, still raises questions about long-term genetic diversity, disease susceptibility, and response to environmental change. Freshwater adaptation occurred over thousands of years, but modern climate trends introduce conditions outside historical experience. Nutrient cycling within the lake presents additional complexity. Surface productivity depends on nutrient availability, which in turn depends on river inflow, sediment release, and microbial recycling. Slight changes in any component can cascade through the ecosystem. Predictive modelling continues improving but remains imperfect. Acoustic environments, previously discussed in relation to underwater sounds, also remain under study. Understanding how geological, biological, and climatic factors influence underwater sound propagation helps both ecological monitoring and environmental management. Continuous data collection improves accuracy over time. Pollution transport pathways require ongoing research. Even remote lakes receive airborne contaminants from distant industrial regions. Identifying sources, transport mechanisms, and ecological impacts involves atmospheric chemistry, hydrology, and biology combined. Invasive species risk assessment remains an active area. Preventive strategies depend on understanding potential introduction routes, ecological vulnerability, and early detection methods. Because Baikal's endemic species evolved in isolation, predicting responses to new competitors or predators remains challenging. Technological limitations persist despite advances. Autonomous vehicles, sonar mapping, environmental DNA sampling, and satellite monitoring all provide valuable data, yet none offer complete coverage. Equipment costs, harsh weather, and logistical constraints limit expedition frequency. Human impact assessment continues evolving. Tourism growth, infrastructure development, and climate-driven economic changes influence the watershed gradually. Detecting subtle ecological shifts early helps inform policy, but separating natural variability from anthropogenic effects often requires long-term data. Interdisciplinary integration itself presents a challenge. Geological, biological, chemical, and climatic data sets must align temporally and spatially for accurate interpretation. Differences in measurement techniques, sampling intervals, and analytical methods complicate synthesis. Public communication about scientific uncertainty sometimes proves difficult. People often prefer definitive answers. Science, however, operates probabilistically. Explaining uncertainty clearly without undermining confidence requires careful messaging. Educational programs increasingly address this directly. Students learn that unanswered questions represent opportunities rather than failures. Lake Baikal provides an excellent case study in ongoing scientific discovery without sensationalism. historical data sets remain valuable. Early expedition records, even when less precise, provide baseline comparisons. Digitizing and integrating these records with modern data enhances long-term trend analysis. International collaboration continues expanding research capacity. Shared equipment, expertise, and funding enable larger projects than any single institution might undertake alone. Cooperation also fosters consistent conservation strategies. Ethical considerations guide future research. Minimizing ecological disturbance while maximizing knowledge requires careful planning. Non-invasive sampling methods gain priority whenever feasible. Climate change uncertainty intersects with nearly every research area. Predicting how temperature trends, precipitation patterns, and ice cover shifts will influence Baikal's ecosystems remains a central scientific question. Despite remaining unknowns, overall understanding of the lake has advanced enormously compared with even a century ago. Most dramatic mystery narratives give way to nuanced ecological and geological complexity when examined scientifically. Curiosity persists, though increasingly directed toward detailed mechanisms rather than large undiscovered animals. That shift reflects maturation of both scientific knowledge and public awareness, and as the discussion of remaining scientific uncertainty settles, attention naturally moves toward a reflective closing perspective on the lake itself, its quiet surface, immense depth, long history, and the continuing relationship between human curiosity and careful observation that shapes how people understand such environments over time. Lake Baikal rarely presents itself in dramatic ways. Most photographs show calm water, wide skies, forested shores, or winter ice stretching quietly toward the horizon. Yet the absence of spectacle does not mean absence of complexity. Over the course of everything considered so far, a consistent pattern appears. The lake's significance comes not from sudden discoveries or hidden giants, but from continuity. Geological processes have shaped it for millions of years. Biological communities adapted gradually. Climate records accumulated layer by layer in sediments. Human understanding followed slowly behind those natural processes. Depth remains one of the defining characteristics. More than 1,600 meters of fresh water create environmental conditions very different from typical lakes. Pressure increases steadily with depth. Temperature stabilizes near 4 degrees Celsius. Light fades completely beyond relatively shallow zones. Organisms living there do not rely on speed, visual dominance, or large size. They rely on efficiency, adaptation, and energy conservation. Amphipods, endemic fish, microbial communities, and the Baikal seal all demonstrate how life adjusts when environmental stability persists over geological timescales. Age contributes equally. Most lakes disappear long before reaching Baikal's longevity. Sediment fills them, climate shifts alter them, or tectonic activity reshapes their basins. Baikal continues evolving slowly because the rift beneath keeps creating space. That geological continuity allowed ecosystems to develop with minimal interruption. Evolutionary specialization followed. Thousands of endemic species emerged, many with traits not seen elsewhere. Isolation reinforces that pattern. Limited biological exchange with other freshwater systems prevented constant species turnover. Local adaptation became the dominant evolutionary force. Some organisms retained characteristics linking them to ancient lineages. Others developed entirely new traits suited specifically to cold, oxygen-rich deep water. None of this required dramatic prehistoric survivors. Gradual adaptation explains observed biodiversity more effectively. Scientific exploration continues refining this understanding. Sonar mapping reveals underwater topography in detail. Submersibles provide direct visual observation. Environmental DNA sampling detects organisms through genetic traces. Long-term monitoring stations record temperature, oxygen, and chemical composition continuously. Each technological advance fills gaps while revealing additional questions. Climate history preserved in sediments provides a broader context. Layers record glacial cycles, vegetation shifts, volcanic ash deposition, and atmospheric dust patterns. These records help scientists reconstruct past environmental conditions not only locally but globally. Understanding how ecosystems responded to previous climate variation improves projections about future changes. Human activity now interacts increasingly with this ancient system. Tourism, fishing, industrial development, and climate change all introduce pressures. Conservation efforts aim to maintain water quality, protect endemic species, and balance economic needs with ecological stability. Awareness continues growing that preserving Baikal benefits not only local communities but global freshwater resources and scientific research. Curiosity remains part of the relationship people have with the lake. Questions about hidden species, unusual sounds, or unexplored depths arise naturally when facing such scale. Scientific evaluation channels that curiosity into measurable investigation rather than speculation. Most results emphasize ecological complexity rather than dramatic unknown animals, yet that complexity proves equally compelling when examined carefully. Psychological responses to deep environments also deserve recognition. Humans evolved to notice uncertainty quickly. Ambiguous stimuli often trigger imaginative interpretation. Understanding this tendency helps maintain balance between curiosity and evidence. It allows appreciation of mystery without abandoning scientific reasoning. Ongoing research highlights how much has already been learned, while acknowledging remaining uncertainties. Microbial diversity continues expanding with improved genetic analysis. Hydrothermal vent ecosystems require further study. Long-term climate trends demand continued monitoring. Each new dataset integrates into an increasingly detailed ecological picture. Educational outreach increasingly focuses on this continuity. Presenting Baikal as a long-term environmental archive rather than a mysterious anomaly encourages informed interest. Students, researchers, and visitors often find sustained ecological stability more fascinating once its implications become clear. Technological innovation ensures exploration will continue. Autonomous underwater vehicles map previously inaccessible areas. Improved sensors detect subtle environmental changes. Data integration across disciplines enhances predictive modeling. Future discoveries will likely involve refined understanding rather than dramatic surprises. Conservation priorities remain closely tied to scientific knowledge. Protecting water quality, preventing invasive species introduction, managing fishing sustainably, and monitoring climate impacts all require reliable data. Research and stewardship increasingly operate together rather than separately. Cultural connections to the lake persist as well. Indigenous traditions emphasizing respect for natural forces coexist with modern scientific approaches. Both perspectives encourage careful interaction with the environment. That shared emphasis on respect may prove essential for long-term preservation. Freshwater systems globally face increasing pressure. Population growth, industrial expansion, and climate variability affect water availability and quality worldwide. Baikal's immense volume offers resilience, yet not immunity. Preventive conservation remains more effective than reactive restoration. As understanding deepens, the lake's quiet character becomes more noticeable. No dramatic reveal appears necessary. Geological time, ecological adaptation, and environmental continuity already provide a narrative far larger than individual discoveries. Observing that continuity calmly often yields clearer insight than searching for sudden spectacle. Scientific progress itself mirrors the lake's pace. Incremental observation, careful measurement, gradual interpretation. Each expedition adds detail. Each dataset refines models. Knowledge accumulates layer by layer, not unlike sediment settling on the lake floor. Questions will continue appearing. Some concern biodiversity, others climate history, geological activity, or conservation strategies. Ongoing research ensures that answers evolve alongside new observations. That process reflects normal scientific development rather than unresolved mystery. And as the water remains still above vast depth, attention settles naturally on observation rather than conclusion, because environments shaped over millions of years rarely produce final answers quickly, and continued careful study often proves more valuable than rushing towards certainty.